What would you do if your fun little kick turned into the biggest mistake of your life? It was a crisp Saturday morning, and the sun was barely peeking through the clouds as Danny revved up his motorcycle. The engine roared to life, filling the empty streets with a rebellious growl. He felt free, unburdened, the wind whipping through his leather jacket. Life was simple that way. No responsibilities, no expectations, just the thrill of the ride. Danny wasn't the type to be overly sentimental. He lived for the moment, especially when it came to his bike. But today, he was feeling especially cocky. He took a sharp turn and sped down the narrow street that led through the park, a place he'd passed countless times but never really bothered to slow down for. As he zipped by, something caught his eye, a little ball of fur scurrying across the sidewalk. A cat, probably just another stray, living its life, minding its own business. Danny smirked, feeling a sudden rush of mischievous energy. Without even thinking, he slammed his boot onto the ground, kicking the small creature lightly as he zoomed past it. Just a bit of fun, he muttered to himself with a chuckle, as the cat yelped and darted off into the bushes. He didn't think much of it. After all, it wasn't like he'd hurt the thing. It was a tiny, insignificant creature, and who was going to care about a cat in the park, anyway? But as he turned the corner and sped off, he had no idea that his careless moment of amusement was about to spiral into something much bigger than he could ever imagine. What Danny didn't know, however, was that the cat he'd just kicked belonged to someone very important, someone with enough power to turn a simple mistake into a nightmare. That little cat wasn't just any stray. That cat was Whiskers, the beloved pet of Donald Trump. And when Whiskers let out that small cry of pain, it wasn't just a random sound in the park. It was the beginning of a chain of events that would rock Danny's world, sending him tumbling into a situation he was utterly unprepared for. As the day went on, Danny had no idea that his life was about to take an unexpected turn. He would soon find himself caught in a storm that he couldn't outrun, no matter how fast his motorcycle could go. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Danny Mitchell was no stranger to trouble. In fact, it seemed to follow him around like a shadow. He'd spent most of his 28 years of life bouncing between different cities, never quite settling anywhere for long. His childhood wasn't the stuff of Hallmark movies. Raised in a rough neighborhood, Danny had learned early on how to fend for himself. His mother, a waitress who worked long hours, was rarely around to provide the stability he needed. His father? Well, he had disappeared before Danny could even remember his face. But none of that mattered to Danny. He didn't dwell on the past. His philosophy was simple: survive today and worry about tomorrow. He had a few friends, but none who stuck around long enough to make a lasting impression. People came and went, just like the city lights he'd ride past in the dead of night. His closest companion was his motorcycle, a powerful beast of chrome and steel that roared like a lion every time he twisted the throttle. It was his escape. On the bike, he was invincible. Despite his rough exterior, Danny wasn't a bad guy, at least, not by his own standards. He just didn't care about the things that society seemed to care about. The rules? The expectations? They didn't apply to him. He was out there to have fun, to feel the wind in his face, and to experience life on his own terms. But there was one thing that always bugged him: people who took life too seriously. He never understood why some folks clung to the idea of following the rules, building relationships, or, heaven forbid, settling down. That just wasn't Danny's style. He lived in the moment, indulging in reckless thrills, and for him, that was enough. One of his oldest friends, Mike, had once tried to talk to him about the importance of relationships and loyalty, but Danny had brushed it off. "Man, you're just stuck in a cage," he'd told Mike as they downed beers at the local dive bar. "Why tie yourself down when you can live free?" But there was more to Danny than his rebellious streak. Beneath that tough shell was a man who secretly craved connection, a man who just didn't know how to open up. His interactions with others were surface level, quick exchanges in a world that moved too fast for anyone to truly understand each other. But Danny didn't mind. He kept to himself. He didn't need anyone, and he certainly didn't need any pets. But fate, as it often does, has a funny way of proving us wrong. Danny's usual route through the park was one he had taken countless times. It was his favorite place to cut through on his way to the next adventure. But today, something was different. Today, his reckless actions would have consequences he never saw coming. As he sped through the park, he didn't even notice the elderly woman sitting on the bench, eyes wide with shock as she clutched a small white leash in her hand. Her gaze followed the tiny cat darting into the bushes, the soft meow still echoing in her mind. Meanwhile, a few blocks away, Donald Trump was having a very different day. Whiskers had been with him for years, through thick and thin, during business deals, and in quiet moments of solitude. The orange tabby wasn't just a pet. Whiskers was part of the family. He was a small creature, but in Trump's grand, sometimes lonely world, Whiskers brought a sense of calm that few other things could. Donald had always found solace in petting the cat after a long day, watching Whiskers curl up next to him while the TV blared in the background. But that afternoon, Whiskers was missing. He'd run off again, as he sometimes did. Donald had just finished a conference call when he noticed the cat's absence. "Whiskers," he called out, walking through his lavish mansion. "Where the heck are you?" It wasn't like Whiskers to go far, but Donald had grown accustomed to checking in on the cat, particularly when something felt off. So when he couldn't find the little tabby anywhere, he began to worry. Unbeknownst to Danny, his small act of mischief was about to set a chain of events in motion that would change his life forever. The consequences of that simple kick were far more significant than he could have ever imagined. And Donald Trump? Well, he wasn't the type of man to let anything slide, especially when it came to something or someone he cared about. But for now, Danny was just speeding along, unaware that the world around him was about to get a whole lot more complicated. What drives you to take chances in life? Do you think Danny's about to learn the hard way? Or will he find a way out of this mess? Whiskers had been part of Donald Trump's life for longer than anyone could remember. The orange tabby had been a constant companion, bringing small moments of peace in an otherwise chaotic world. Trump, despite his larger-than-life persona, had always found comfort in the soft purring of his pet. It was a strange, almost tender contrast to the brash businessman known to the public. Whiskers wasn't just a pet. He was a fixture in Trump's life. People who had visited the Trump Tower or his Mar-a-Lago estate often recalled seeing Whiskers lounging lazily in a sunbeam, tail flicking back and forth. He would sneak into meetings, jumping onto the desk of anyone sitting too still for too long, demanding attention and affection. No one could deny that Whiskers had a knack for softening the hard edges of his owner's tough persona. But that morning, Whiskers was nowhere to be found. Donald had just wrapped up a call with some advisors about the upcoming election campaign. He was sitting in his study, flipping through some documents when he realized the house had grown unusually quiet. The absence of Whiskers was impossible to ignore. Trump had learned to live with the quiet hustle of his businesses, the constant ringing of phones, and the noise of the world. But when Whiskers wasn't around, it was different. He stood up and walked around his vast home, calling out his cat's name. "Whiskers," he called again, though he knew the cat wouldn't come just because he asked. A soft meow sounded from the hallway, faint but unmistakable. Donald turned toward the sound and followed it to the back door that led out to the garden. The door was ajar. Whiskers must have slipped out while he wasn't paying attention. He stepped outside, squinting into the sunlight. The garden was expansive, filled with perfectly manicured hedges, fountains, and the kind of luxury only a billionaire could afford. But it was eerily quiet. Trump wasn't particularly worried at first, knowing that Whiskers would always come back when he was ready. But then, as he walked around the side of the house, he noticed something strange. A small group of people had gathered at the park across the street. They seemed to be staring at something, and Trump, curious as ever, walked over. It didn't take long before he saw it. A small crowd was gathered around an elderly woman sitting on a bench, clutching something in her hands. His heart sank when he realized it was Whiskers, the tabby, now visibly shaken. The poor thing was trembling, clearly distressed. "Hey, what happened to my cat?" Trump barked, his usual commanding tone slipping out instinctively. The elderly woman, still clutching the cat in her arms, looked up at him in surprise. She didn't recognize him, But there was a sense of urgency in her voice as she explained. This young man kicked your cat. Right out there, in the park. He didn't care about the poor thing at all. Trump's jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides. His mind raced. Who would do such a thing? Who would harm his cat, of all things? Without a second thought, he pulled out his phone and dialed his assistant. Find out everything you can about a man who rides a motorcycle through the park. I want to know who he is, where he's from, and why he thinks he can get away with this. His usual business dealings didn't involve chasing down petty criminals, but this was different. Whiskers wasn't just any cat. He was a symbol, a part of Trump's world that no one, absolutely no one, had the right to disrupt. As Danny sped through the city streets, he had no idea that his life was about to collide with the world of the rich and powerful. He was simply enjoying the adrenaline rush, listening to the hum of the engine beneath him. It had been a while since he'd had a good ride, and the day felt perfect for it. The park had been a usual stop, a place to cool off and maybe grab a quick drink at the small cafe nearby. He hadn't even noticed the elderly woman sitting on the bench when he kicked the cat. It had been a spur-of-the-moment thing, a playful impulse that he immediately regretted, but only for a second. Now, as Danny made his way through the city, the adrenaline high was wearing off, replaced by the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. It wasn't until his phone buzzed in his pocket that he realized the situation had taken a drastic turn. The text came in from Mike. Bro, you won't believe this, but Trump's looking for you. He's pissed. Big time. Danny scoffed, not taking it seriously. Trump? What does he want with me? He muttered, shaking his head. But then the phone rang. The name on the screen made him freeze. Trump? Hello? Danny answered, trying to keep his voice casual, though his stomach was churning. Is this Danny Mitchell? Came the voice on the other end. Sharp, direct, and unmistakable. Yeah. Who's this? Danny replied, suddenly aware of how ridiculous the situation had become. You kicked my cat, Donald Trump said coldly, his tone leaving no room for misunderstanding. Danny blinked, then laughed nervously. Wait a second, you're telling me you're Donald Trump? Yes, I am, Trump's voice cut through the line. And you're going to regret what you did, kid. You don't touch what's mine. Not my cat. Not anything. Danny felt his heart race. This wasn't a prank call, and the man on the other end of the line wasn't joking. Look, man, I didn't mean anything by it. It was just a stupid thing to do, Danny stammered, realizing too late how badly he had messed up. You better fix this, Trump snapped. You'll be hearing from my people. And trust me, you don't want to make me any angrier. The line went dead. Danny sat there in stunned silence, the weight of the situation finally hitting him. What had he just gotten himself into? Danny stared at his phone, his mind racing. What had just happened? 1 minute, he was speeding through the park, the wind in his hair, and the next, he had somehow attracted the wrath of Donald Trump. He couldn't believe it. Kicking a cat, a dumb, spur-of-the-moment decision. And now the billionaire himself was personally involved? This wasn't a random encounter. No, this was a whole different ballgame. Trump didn't deal with ordinary people. Trump didn't even deal with mistakes like the one Danny had made. As far as Danny knew, people didn't just get a call from Donald Trump after doing something dumb. He paced back and forth in his apartment, hands running through his hair. I gotta fix this, he thought. But how? The whole thing seemed absurd, but the reality was sinking in quickly. It wasn't just some angry cat owner. Trump had power, influence, and a reputation for handling things his way. The problem was, Danny had no idea what that way looked like. The call had left him shaken, and now he had no choice but to figure out how to deal with the fallout. He grabbed his jacket and stormed out of his apartment, his mind still spinning. He needed answers, a plan, anything to make this right. As he walked down the crowded sidewalk, he spotted Mike's familiar face standing near the corner of the street, waving him over. Man, what the hell is going on? Mike asked as Danny approached, looking both concerned and confused. I don't know, Mike. I really messed up. Trump? Danny stopped, feeling the absurdity of it all. He called me. Himself. Like, himself, Mike. He's pissed. Mike blinked a few times, trying to wrap his head around it. Wait, So that cat you kicked was his cat? The Trump? No way. Danny sighed. Yeah, I kicked his damn cat, and now he's coming after me. I don't know what to do. This is way over my head. Mike crossed his arms and leaned against the brick wall. Okay, first things first. How serious is this? I mean, Trump's a busy guy, right? Maybe he's just blowing off some steam. What if you just lay low for a bit? You know, let it cool off. Danny shook his head. Nah, this guy doesn't let things slide. I heard stories about how he handles situations like this. He's not the kind of guy you just ignore. And I don't think he's done with me. Not by a long shot. The weight of the situation pressed down on him harder now. His phone buzzed again, and his stomach dropped when he saw the name on the screen. Who is it? Mike asked, noticing the change in Danny's expression. It's his people, Danny muttered, his voice trembling. This is it. He answered the call, trying his best to sound calm. Hello? Mr. Mitchell, a cold, professional voice said on the other end. This is Lisa from Mr. Trump's office. You're required to meet with Mr. Trump immediately. He is arranging a meeting for you, and you will attend. There are no exceptions. Understood? Danny's heart skipped a beat. Wait, hold on, he stammered. What do you mean, meet with him? I don't even know what this is about. It was just a stupid mistake. I didn't mean anything by it. The voice was unflinching. Mr. Trump does not take kindly to disrespect, Mr. Mitchell. You'll be given the details of the meeting soon. Be ready. The call ended abruptly, leaving Danny standing there in a daze. Mike didn't know what to say. Dude, this is insane. What are you gonna do? Danny didn't have an answer. There was nothing he could do but go through with it. Trump was a force, a man who had made his fortune by controlling every detail, every moment. He was used to getting what he wanted, and now he wanted to meet with Danny. It was beyond anything Danny had ever imagined. Later that evening, Danny found himself standing in front of a sleek black car, its tinted windows reflecting the fading light of the day. Two men in dark suits stood at attention by the car. They didn't say a word as Danny approached, and their cold stares told him everything he needed to know. This was serious. Get in, one of them said simply. Danny hesitated, the enormity of the situation weighing on him. This wasn't a simple apology. This was something bigger than him. Taking a deep breath, he climbed into the back seat of the car, and the door shut with a soft click behind him. As the vehicle pulled away from the curb, Danny tried to settle his nerves. His mind raced, replaying every possible scenario in which this could go wrong. The car sped through the streets, moving quickly through the upscale neighborhoods that Danny had only seen from a distance. They were heading toward a part of town that screamed wealth and power. The kind of place where regular guys like Danny didn't belong. He felt out of place, like an intruder in a world that didn't care for him. But here he was, caught in the middle of it. And if he didn't handle this right, he could be in a whole lot of trouble. The car finally came to a stop in front of a towering building with gold accents that reflected the setting sun. Trump Tower. Mr. Mitchell, this way, the driver said, holding the door open. Danny stepped out of the car, his stomach in knots. He walked up the marble steps, the weight of every step making his anxiety grow. The door swung open, and he was ushered inside. The lobby was vast, the ceilings high, and the walls lined with expensive art and polished stone. He could feel the money and power radiating from every corner of the building. But none of it mattered. None of it could help him now. A man in a black suit appeared, motioning for him to follow. They walked through a series of hallways, finally stopping at a door marked Private. Danny swallowed hard as the door opened, and there, standing behind a massive wooden desk, was Donald Trump himself. Mr. Mitchell, Trump said, his voice colder than Danny had ever imagined. You've made quite an impression on me. Danny stepped forward, trying to maintain some semblance of confidence. Mr. Trump, I'm really sorry about what happened. It was a mistake. I didn't mean anything by it. Honestly, I didn't. Trump held up a hand, silencing him. I don't want excuses. You disrespected my cat. And in my world, that's something you pay for. Danny's heart dropped. I didn't know. I didn't think. Trump interrupted again, his eyes narrowing. You will learn to think before you act from now on. You're lucky I'm even giving you a chance to explain yourself. The silence between them was deafening as Trump studied him. Then he leaned back in his chair, a small smirk forming on his face. I'm giving you a choice, Mr. Mitchell. You can walk out of here and forget this happened, or you can make things right. But you won't be doing it alone. Danny had no idea what Trump meant, but one thing was clear. This was only the beginning, and his world was about to change forever. What's the worst thing you've ever done on impulse? Do you think Danny's got a chance at redemption? Or has he already gone too far? Danny stood frozen in front of Donald Trump's desk, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The tension was thick in the air, and every word Trump spoke seemed to echo in his mind long after it had been said. The billionaire's eyes were sharp, calculating, as if he were assessing every fiber of Danny's being. There was no denying it. Danny had messed up, and now it was time to pay the price. Trump's voice broke the silence. You don't know what kind of world you're stepping into, kid. This isn't the kind of place where you can just screw around and hope for the best. You've made a mistake, but I'll give you a chance to make it right. Danny's heart raced. What do you want from me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean to hurt your cat. It was a dumb, impulsive thing, and I'm sorry, okay? But what can I do now? I'm just a guy, you know? I don't have the resources to fix this. Trump chuckled, leaning back in his chair. You're right about one thing, Mitchell. You're just a guy. But that's about to change. Danny frowned. What do you mean? Look, Trump said, his voice becoming more intense. You kicked my cat, but you didn't realize what that meant. My people, my world, doesn't take kindly to anyone causing trouble. But I also know you're not a bad kid. I'm offering you a chance to prove it. You're going to work for me. Danny blinked, trying to process what he had just heard. Work for you? He asked incredulously. Doing what? Trump's smirk widened. That's the fun part. I'm going to give you a task, something that'll get you in the door of my world. You'll work with some of the people who run the business, see how things work, and learn what it means to have real power. It's a rare opportunity, and it's not something most people would get. But you're lucky. You've been thrown into my path, and now you get to make something of it. Danny felt a mix of confusion and disbelief. But I don't know anything about your world, Mr. Trump. I'm just a guy who works odd jobs. I'm not some business genius. Trump's gaze hardened, his voice unwavering. That's exactly why you need to learn. You'll work with my people, and you'll do what's required to prove your loyalty. There's no room for weakness in this world, and if you want to survive, you'll have to be tough. Show me you can handle it, and maybe you'll come out the other side a better man. Danny hesitated. It sounded like a nightmare. The idea of being thrown into the world of billionaires, power brokers, and high-stakes games terrified him. But at the same time, he knew he had no choice. He had crossed a line, and now it was time to face the consequences. What's the catch? Danny asked, his voice cautious. Trump leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. There's always a catch, Mitchell. You're not getting off that easy. If you screw up, if you show any weakness, any sign of disrespect, you'll be out. And when you're out, you'll regret it. So, don't make the same mistake twice. Danny swallowed hard, trying to keep his composure. The last thing he wanted was to become a pawn in some game he didn't understand, but the alternative didn't seem much better. He was in too deep now. I'll do it, Danny said finally, his voice resolute, though his mind was still reeling. I'll work for you. I'll prove I can handle it. Trump gave him a long, measuring look. Then, with a nod, he leaned back in his chair. Good. You'll start tomorrow. I'll have someone meet you at the office, give you the rundown, and get you set up. Don't make me regret this. The next morning, Danny woke up early, his stomach tied in knots. He had no idea what he had gotten himself into. The weight of his decision was heavier than he could have imagined. He had agreed to work for Donald Trump, a man whose world was full of power, money, and influence. And here he was, a guy who had spent most of his life bouncing between dead-end jobs, suddenly thrown into the deep end of the corporate elite. He showered quickly, dressing in the best clothes he had. Nothing fancy, but at least he looked presentable. The ride to the Trump Tower felt like an eternity, the car winding through the streets of New York, past towering skyscrapers and luxury boutiques. As the car pulled up to the entrance of the Trump Tower, Danny's nerves went into overdrive. This wasn't a place where people like him belonged. The doorman opened the door for him, and he stepped out, trying to ignore the butterflies in his stomach. He walked through the grand lobby, trying not to look out of place. The marble floors, the gold accents, the expensive art. It all seemed like another world. And yet, here he was, about to enter it. A man in a sharp suit approached him. "Mr. Mitchell? I'm Greg. Mr. Trump sent me to show you to your office." Danny nodded, following the man through a maze of hallways, each one more luxurious than the last. Finally, they reached a door at the end of a long corridor. Greg opened it and gestured for Danny to enter. Inside, the office was massive, larger than any apartment Danny had ever been in. The walls were lined with bookshelves, and the furniture was sleek, modern, and expensive. A massive desk sat at the center of the room, and behind it, a large window offered a stunning view of the city skyline. It was a place for power, for business, and Danny had to find a way to survive here. "Sit down," Greg said, his voice calm but firm. "You'll be working with me and the team. Mr. Trump has big plans for you. I'm going to give you your first assignment." Danny took a seat, trying to steady his nerves. He didn't know what to expect, but he knew one thing. His life was never going to be the same again. Greg handed him a folder with a thick stack of papers inside. "This is your first project. You'll be helping us handle a series of negotiations. There's a lot of money on the line, so you'll need to be sharp. You'll learn fast, but you've got to keep your wits about you. The stakes are high." Danny opened the folder, scanning the contents. The names, the deals, the numbers. It all seemed so far beyond him. But he wasn't going to back down now. This was his chance to prove himself. "Any questions?" Greg asked, his tone unreadable. Danny glanced at the documents one more time before responding. "How do I fit into all of this? I mean, I don't know anything about high-level business deals or negotiations." Greg's expression softened, just slightly. "That's why you're here. We'll teach you. But remember this, you'll sink or swim based on what you do here. And you'll be judged on how quickly you pick things up." Danny swallowed. There was no turning back now. The world of billionaires and power brokers had swallowed him whole, and he had no choice but to dive in head first. As the day wore on, Danny tried to focus on the task at hand, but his mind kept drifting. His first real assignment had come in fast, and it was already clear. He was in over his head, but something inside him wouldn't let him quit. Not yet. Not when he had the chance to prove himself. For better or worse, this was his new reality. And now, the only thing left to do was survive. Can Danny learn to navigate this cutthroat world, or will he drown in the process? Only time will tell. Danny's first day at Trump Tower felt like a blur. The pressure was relentless, the expectations unspoken but clear. Every move he made, every word he spoke, seemed to carry the weight of his future, and he was beginning to feel the sting of reality. This wasn't a world that forgave mistakes. It demanded perfection, or else you were out. After Greg handed him the thick folder with details of his first assignment, Danny had been plunged straight into the deep end. There were meetings with people who looked at him like he didn't belong, and the way they spoke about business, wealth, and power was a language Danny didn't understand. Numbers, contracts, and strategies flew over his head, and all he could do was nod along, trying to appear confident despite feeling completely out of place. By late afternoon, his head was swimming. His phone buzzed with notifications, calls from friends who had no idea where he was, asking what was going on, how his day had gone. He ignored them. There was no time for distractions. He had been warned. Time was a luxury he didn't have. Greg had told him earlier that day that they would be working on a negotiation with a company that was trying to secure a large property deal. It was a big opportunity, and it wasn't just about securing the deal. It was about impressing the people who could make or break Danny's future in Trump's world. By the time the sun began to set, Danny had been sitting in a glass-walled conference room, staring at a sea of paperwork in front of him. He tried to focus, but the more he read, the more his head spun. He wasn't cut out for this. He knew that deep down. He glanced up at the clock, almost 7 p.m. He hadn't had a chance to eat, and his stomach growled in protest. He rubbed his eyes, trying to stave off the exhaustion creeping in. Just then, the door to the conference room opened and Greg walked in. His face was stern, but there was a hint of approval in his eyes. "Getting the hang of things, Mitchell?" Greg asked, his tone neutral. I'm trying. It's a lot, but I'm doing my best," Danny replied, feeling embarrassed. Greg nodded, walking over to the table where Danny was sitting. He picked up the stack of papers in front of him, flipping through them with practiced ease. "It's not enough to just try, Mitchell. You have to learn quickly. You're not here to waste time." "I get that," Danny muttered, though he wasn't sure he did. "But, honestly, I don't know how you all do this. It's so much. I don't understand half of it." Greg raised an eyebrow, but didn't say anything for a moment. He placed the papers down on the table and looked directly at Danny. "The fact that you're even here means you have something we think is worth investing in. But don't get too comfortable. Trump doesn't do handouts. If you want to stay in this world, you have to prove yourself." Danny exhaled slowly, nodding. "I understand, but I still don't get why I'm even here. You could have picked anyone else." Greg gave him a hard look. "You're here because you have potential. That's it. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. You've got a chance to make something of yourself, but it won't last forever if you don't step it up. People are watching you. Not just Trump, but everyone who works here. And if you mess up, there's no second chance." Danny felt a pit form in his stomach. He had been thrown into this high-stakes game with nothing but his wits to rely on, and it was already starting to feel like a losing battle. But something, maybe the fire in his gut, maybe the thought of proving everyone wrong, kept him from walking away. "Okay," Danny said, his voice firm. "What do you want me to do next?" Greg smiled, a brief flash of approval. "Good. You're learning." He motioned for Danny to follow him as they walked out of the conference room. "Tonight, you'll attend a dinner with some key figures involved in the negotiations. Trump's going to be there. We'll see how you handle it." Danny's heart skipped a beat. Dinner? With Trump? He hadn't expected this kind of responsibility on his first day, but if it meant staying in the game, he would play along. "Got it," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. That evening, Danny found himself in a private dining room at one of the most luxurious restaurants in New York. The atmosphere was sleek and sophisticated. Crystal chandeliers, polished floors, and waitstaff dressed in black tie uniforms. Danny felt underdressed, but there was no turning back now. He had to blend in. Greg had given him a brief rundown before they arrived. "You're here to observe. Don't talk unless you're spoken to. Watch how the players at this table move and learn. This is the kind of world you're in now." Danny tried to keep his nerves in check as they entered the room. At the head of the table sat Donald Trump, his presence commanding the entire room. He was engaged in a conversation with a few other businessmen, but as Danny walked in, Trump's eyes shifted toward him. "Mitchell," Trump said, his voice cool but not unkind. "Glad you could join us." Danny nodded, trying his best to keep his composure. "Thank you for having me, Mr. Trump." Trump raised an eyebrow, clearly assessing him. "Sit. Have a drink. You're going to need it if you want to survive tonight." The rest of the dinner was a blur of names, numbers, and strategic discussions that Danny could barely follow. The big players in the room, men who had made fortunes and carved out legacies, spoke in a language of deals, investments, and power moves. But Danny did his best to observe, taking mental notes on how everyone interacted, how each person spoke, and how they handled the constant undercurrent of tension in the room. At one point, Trump turned to him and asked a direct question. "What do you think of the deal we're working on, Mitchell?" Danny's heart stopped. He hadn't been prepared for this. He had barely been able to understand the conversation up until that point, let alone form a coherent opinion about it. But there was no backing out now. He cleared his throat, trying to sound confident. "Well, from what I gather, the terms seem to be in everyone's favor. But I'd say the real question is about the timing. There are a lot of risks involved, especially considering the market volatility. It might be worth taking a step back and reassessing the situation before we pull the trigger." Trump studied him, his expression unreadable. The room fell silent for a moment, the other businessmen watching with interest. Then, Trump nodded slowly. "Not bad, Mitchell. Not bad at all." Danny felt a small sense of relief wash over him. Maybe he wasn't completely out of his depth. By the end of the evening, Danny had learned more about this world than he ever thought possible. But more importantly, he had realized something. The stakes were higher than he had imagined. He had made it through the dinner without completely embarrassing himself. That was a win, right? As Greg drove him back to his apartment, Danny couldn't stop replaying the events of the evening in his mind. He was in a world where power and money ruled, and there were no guarantees. But for the first time since he had entered Trump Tower, Danny felt like maybe, just maybe, he had a shot. But would it be enough? Would he survive long enough to prove himself, or would this be his one and only chance? Time would tell. The next few days passed in a blur of meetings, phone calls, and endless paperwork. Danny had barely had a chance to catch his breath since his first dinner with Donald Trump. The world he was thrust into was nothing like anything he had ever known. The people he encountered weren't just powerful. They were ruthless, calculating, and completely unbothered by the moral dilemmas that would plague normal people. Here, it was all about the bottom line. But one thing became clear to Danny. He wasn't just learning business. He was learning how to play the game. The people at the top didn't get there by being nice or moral. They got there by being shrewd, strategic, and willing to do whatever it took. And if Danny wanted to make it in this world, he'd have to learn to think like them. By the end of the week, Trump had given him another task. This time, it wasn't just about observing. It was about participating. He had been assigned to help close a deal with a major investor who was considering backing one of Trump's newest real estate ventures. It was a huge opportunity, and everyone at the table would be watching Danny's every move. The meeting was set for the following Monday. Danny arrived at Trump Tower early, trying to shake the nerves that were bubbling up in his stomach. He had learned quickly that in this world, confidence was everything. If you showed even a hint of weakness, it was over. He couldn't afford to make any more mistakes, especially not after the dinner with Trump. He had impressed Trump once, but he knew that wouldn't last forever. He needed to keep proving himself. As he entered the grand lobby of Trump Tower, his thoughts were interrupted by a sharp voice. "Mitchell." Greg's voice echoed across the room. Danny turned to see his supervisor striding toward him, his expression serious. "You ready for today?" Danny gave a quick nod, doing his best to suppress the nerves. "As ready as I'll ever be." Greg studied him for a moment, his eyes narrowing. "You'd better be. The investors we're meeting today are no joke. You mess this up, and you'll have a lot more than just Trump's wrath to deal with. The people you'll be negotiating with? They play hard, and they don't trust easily. You'll need to earn their respect fast, or they'll chew you up and spit you out." Danny swallowed hard, trying to focus on Greg's words. "Got it. I won't let you down." "Good," Greg said, slapping him on the back as they walked toward the elevators. "Let's go make this deal happen." The conference room was massive, the table so long it felt like it stretched on forever. The walls were adorned with abstract art, and the large windows gave a stunning view of the city below. A group of well-dressed men and women had already gathered around the table. They were serious, calculating, and all about business. Every one of them had an air of authority, and Danny felt his heart race as he took his seat. Donald Trump was at the head of the table, as usual. His presence filled the room, and the others immediately fell into line. Trump's gaze scanned the room, and when it landed on Danny, he gave a small nod. It was a sign of acknowledgement, but it didn't feel like a compliment. It felt like a challenge that Danny was determined to meet. The lead investor, a tall man with sharp features named Charles Wexler, spoke first. "Mr. Trump," he said, his voice smooth and confident, "we've been considering your offer for a while, but we have some concerns about the long-term viability of the project. The market is unstable, and we need more reassurance that this is a sound investment." Danny felt his palms sweat as Wexler's eyes shifted to him. Trump had made it clear that Danny was to be involved in every aspect of this deal, which meant he was expected to contribute. The problem was, Danny didn't have the first clue about real estate investments or the intricacies of the market. "Mr. Wexler," Danny said, surprising himself with how steady his voice sounded, "I understand your concerns, but I think the question here isn't about the market, it's about the opportunity. You see, the volatility of the market is what makes this project unique. While most people are running for cover, We're positioning ourselves to take advantage of this uncertainty. The risks are high, but the rewards are even higher if we move quickly. This isn't just about real estate. It's about timing. And timing, as we know, is everything. Wexler raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Interesting perspective. But how do you propose we mitigate the risks, young man? Danny paused, his mind racing. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him, watching his every move. He had no choice but to take a chance. I propose a multi-step approach, Danny said, gaining momentum. We diversify the investment. We break the project down into smaller phases, each one with clear metrics to measure success. That way, if one phase doesn't work out, we have options. We don't put everything on the line all at once. We test the waters before fully committing. Greg, sitting next to him, looked impressed. Trump's eyes narrowed, considering Danny's words. Wexler leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. It's a calculated approach. I'll give you that. But you'll have to prove it to me. The conversation shifted back and forth between Trump, Wexler, and the other investors. Danny sat quietly for the most part, absorbing the discussion, but he was more confident now. He had found his voice, and he was starting to understand how this world worked. It wasn't just about being smart. It was about presenting ideas with conviction, even if you weren't entirely sure they'd work. The meeting dragged on for what felt like hours. Every word, every decision, seemed to carry enormous weight. Danny's mind raced to keep up, but he was getting better at it. Little by little, he was learning how to move in the world of business sharks. Finally, just as the meeting was wrapping up, Trump turned to him. "Nice job, Mitchell," he said, his voice measured but not without approval. "You actually contributed something useful. Keep that up, and you'll earn your place here." Danny's heart leapt in his chest. It wasn't a glowing endorsement, but it was something. He had impressed Trump. For now, that was enough. As they left the conference room, Greg clapped him on the back again. "Well done," he said, his tone a little more relaxed than before. "You passed your first real test." Danny let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "I didn't screw it up?" Greg laughed. "You didn't just not screw it up. You actually made a solid impression. Keep it up, Mitchell. You're on the right track." As they walked through the hallways of Trump Tower, Danny felt a surge of pride. He had done it. He had survived his first real test in this world of power, wealth, and ruthless competition. But the road ahead was still long, and he knew he couldn't let his guard down. There was always another challenge lurking around the corner. But Danny was ready. He had earned a small victory today, but tomorrow was a new battle. And in this world, victory wasn't just about surviving. It was about thriving. Would Danny's rising confidence and newfound knowledge be enough to keep him afloat in this high-stakes world? Or would the tides turn against him? Only time would tell. Danny woke up early the next morning, the city lights still blinking faintly outside his apartment window. He had barely slept, his mind still racing over the events of the past few days. He had earned Trump's approval, barely, but he knew better than to think that would be enough. This world was relentless, and Danny was just beginning to understand that the price of success wasn't just paid in time and effort. It was paid in compromise, in choices that would haunt him. As he made coffee and stared out the window, Danny couldn't help but think of how quickly everything had escalated. He was still getting used to the lifestyle, the people, and the expectations, but the stakes were growing higher every day. Trump, Greg, and the others had all made it clear that there was no room for failure. One wrong move and it was over. And Danny knew that now. He had to push forward, even if it meant sacrificing parts of himself he wasn't sure he could give up. The phone rang, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was Greg. "Mitchell," Greg's voice was terse. "We need you at the office in an hour. Trump wants to meet with you." Danny's heart skipped a beat. Trump wanted to meet with him? The last time he'd had a one-on-one with Trump, it had been a brief exchange after the investors' meeting. This felt different. This was personal. "I'll be there," Danny replied, trying to sound calm, though his pulse was racing. An hour later, Danny found himself standing outside one of the most luxurious offices in New York City, Trump's private suite on the top floor of Trump Tower. He had been here once before, but this time felt different. He wasn't just walking in as a new hire. He was walking in as someone who had to prove his worth, who had to show that he belonged in this world of power and money. As the elevator doors opened, Danny stepped out into the expansive office, where the walls were lined with awards, golden accolades, and framed photos of Trump with world leaders. The room exuded success, and it felt like a place where decisions were made that shaped the world. Trump was sitting at his desk, his expression unreadable as he glanced up from a document he was reviewing. He motioned for Danny to sit down. "Mitchell," Trump began, his voice as firm as always. "We've got an opportunity coming up. I need someone I can trust to handle it. That someone is you." Danny blinked, not sure if he had heard correctly. "Me, sir? Are you sure?" Trump's lips twitched into a small smile, but there was no warmth behind it. "Yes, you've shown promise. You're smart enough to handle this, but I need to know I can count on you. This isn't going to be easy." Danny nodded, trying to steady his nerves. "I'm ready for whatever comes." Trump leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping thoughtfully on the edge of the desk. "This deal involves a company that's been underperforming. Their leadership is weak, and I've been watching them closely. There's a lot of money at stake, and I need someone to convince them that they need Trump to save them. You're going to lead the pitch, Mitchell. You'll be the face of this deal." Danny's mind whirred. He had no experience leading a deal like this, let alone convincing a faltering company to give up control. But he couldn't back down. If this was the opportunity Trump was offering him, it was one he couldn't afford to miss. "I understand, sir," Danny said, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of doubt in his head. "Good," Trump replied. "I'll give you all the resources you need. You'll have a team of people backing you up, but ultimately, it's on you. You're the one who has to sell them on the idea that we're the solution." Danny swallowed, his throat dry. "And if they say no?" Trump's gaze hardened. "Then we walk away. But don't even think about failing. People who fail don't last in my world. You've seen how this place works. It's about winning, always." Danny sat in silence for a moment, feeling the weight of Trump's words settle heavily on his shoulders. This wasn't just a deal. It was a test of his ability to keep up with the ruthless game he had entered. "All right, Mitchell," Trump said, breaking the silence. "You've got 2 weeks. Make it count." The next few days were a blur of preparation. Danny pored over documents, made countless phone calls, and spent hours meeting with different team members, all while trying to grasp the finer details of the deal Trump had given him. The company they were targeting was struggling, its leadership in disarray. There were opportunities, of course, but they were buried under layers of mismanagement and internal strife. Greg, as usual, was a constant presence, providing guidance and feedback. "You're doing well, Mitchell," Greg said during one of their late-night meetings. "But remember, this is about selling a vision. You're not just presenting facts. You're convincing them that they need us, that they have no choice but to take our offer." Danny nodded, though doubt lingered in the back of his mind. "How do you do it, Greg? How do you stay so calm when everything is on the line?" Greg's expression softened slightly. "Because I know what I'm doing, Mitchell. This is what I've been trained for. It's not about emotion. It's about control. You have to learn to stay in control at all times, no matter how chaotic it gets." "Control," Danny repeated, mulling over the word. It sounded simple enough, but he wasn't sure he had it in him yet. As the day of the pitch approached, Danny found himself lying awake at night, his mind racing with potential scenarios. What if they didn't buy into the vision? What if they saw through his inexperience? What if he wasn't good enough? But then, he remembered what Trump had said, "Don't fail." Failure wasn't an option. Danny had made it this far, and there was no turning back now. The day of the pitch arrived, and Danny was a bundle of nerves. He walked into the conference room with his team, trying to maintain his composure. The investors from the struggling company were already seated, their faces unreadable as they waited for him to begin. Trump had made it clear that Danny would be leading this pitch, but he could feel the weight of everyone's expectations on his shoulders. He glanced at Greg, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. It was time. "Good afternoon," Danny began, his voice shaky at first but growing steadier as he spoke. "Thank you for taking the time to meet with us today. We understand that your company is facing some significant challenges, but we believe there's a way forward, one that will allow you to not only survive but thrive in a rapidly changing market. And that path involves partnering with us." As Danny laid out the vision for the company, he could feel the tension in the room. The investors listened intently, their eyes never leaving him, as he walked them through the potential benefits of working with Trump's team. He emphasized the resources Trump could bring to the table, the market dominance they could achieve, and the transformation they could undergo under the right leadership. By the end of the presentation, the room was silent. The investors exchanged glances, their faces unreadable. Danny's stomach churned, but he knew he had given it his best shot. Finally, Charles Wexler, one of the lead investors, spoke. "You've made your case, Mitchell," he said slowly, "but we still have concerns. This is a big move, and we need to be sure it's the right one." Danny felt his heart drop. He had been so sure that his pitch would be enough, but it wasn't. Not yet. The deal was still hanging in the balance. As the meeting ended and the investors left the room, Danny felt a strange sense of unease settle over him. He had done everything he could, but in this world, even the best efforts didn't always lead to success. Trump turned to him as the last of the investors exited the room. "Not bad, Mitchell," he said. "You held your ground, but you're not done yet. You need to show them we're the only choice they have." Danny nodded, feeling a deep sense of exhaustion. He had given his all, but he couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how hard he worked, it might never be enough. In this world, success wasn't guaranteed, and the price of ambition was always higher than you expected. Danny's hands shook as he walked back to his office, the weight of Trump's words still lingering heavily in the air. He had held his ground in the pitch meeting, but it hadn't been enough to seal the deal. Trump's comments had been encouraging, but they were a reminder that in this world, nothing was guaranteed. Not even hard work. The world he was in now was a world of constant pressure, always having to prove himself, always having to stay one step ahead. There was no room for hesitation, no time for doubt. Every decision was a gamble, every move a calculated risk. The stakes were high, and failure meant more than just losing a deal. It meant losing everything. As Danny sat at his desk, he couldn't help but wonder if he was cut out for this. Maybe he didn't belong in this ruthless world of high-stakes business. Maybe he wasn't as smart, as strategic, as confident as the people around him. The self-doubt gnawed at him, a constant companion that made it harder to focus on the tasks at hand. He was interrupted by a knock on the door. Greg's voice called out from the hallway. "Mitchell, you in there?" Danny quickly wiped his hands on his pants and stood up. "Yeah, Greg, come in." Greg walked into the office with his usual confident swagger, a briefcase in hand and a knowing look on his face. He didn't waste any time with pleasantries. "How'd it go?" Greg asked, sitting down in the chair across from Danny. "I don't know," Danny admitted, feeling the weight of the question pressing on him. "They didn't seem sold. I did everything I could, but I still think they have doubts." Greg raised an eyebrow. "And you think that's unusual? These are tough people, Mitchell. They don't just hand out deals to anyone. You're competing against some of the best in the game. If you think this is hard, just wait until the next one." Danny swallowed, feeling the familiar knot of anxiety in his chest. "So, what do I do now? Do I just wait and hope they come around?" Greg shook his head, his expression hardening. "No, you don't sit around and wait. You go back in there. You find out what they're really worried about. You address their concerns, and you don't stop until they see things your way." Danny wasn't sure how much more he could give, but then again, he didn't have a choice. What if they don't listen? What if they decide to walk away? Greg's eyes narrowed. "Then you walk away. You move on to the next one. There's always another deal, Mitchell. Always. But you have to make sure you don't let one failure stop you from getting to the next opportunity. In this world, if you show weakness, they'll eat you alive. You can't afford to doubt yourself, not for a second." Greg's words stung, but there was truth in them. Danny had already been given more chances than most people ever got. If he didn't take advantage of this opportunity, if he didn't keep pushing forward, he knew he'd be just another forgotten name in the fast-paced, ever-changing world of business. "All right," Danny said, straightening up in his chair. "I'll go back. I'll figure it out." "Good," Greg said with a sharp nod. "You've got the right mindset. Now, go get it." That afternoon, Danny did exactly as Greg suggested. He reached out to the investors and requested another meeting. He needed to understand their hesitations and to address the concerns they hadn't fully articulated in the first meeting. He wasn't going to let this slip away just because things were tough. If there was one thing Danny had learned from the people around him, it was that success wasn't handed to you. You had to take it. The second meeting was scheduled for the following week, and Danny spent the next few days preparing. He went over the numbers again and again, determined to find the one angle that would convince them to sign on. But as the days passed, the pressure began to mount. Trump had been clear. This deal had to happen. He wasn't known for his patience, and Danny knew that if he failed again, there would be consequences. The morning of the second pitch, Danny felt a familiar weight in his chest. This time, he was determined to walk into that room with absolute confidence, no matter how he felt inside. He had a plan, he had the data, and he wasn't going to let anything distract him. He had to make them see things his way. As he arrived at the conference room, his mind buzzed with the talking points he'd rehearsed. The investors were already seated, their faces as unreadable as before. This time, Charles Wexler was the first to speak. "Mitchell," Wexler said, his voice flat, "you asked for another meeting. What makes you think we should reconsider?" Danny took a deep breath. It was now or never. "Mr. Wexler, I understand your concerns, and I've been thinking about them nonstop. The reality is that this market is unpredictable. But that unpredictability is exactly what we're prepared for. We have the resources to weather any storm, and we've seen this kind of market disruption before. The key is not to shy away from it, but to use it to our advantage. We're in a position to act quickly, strategically, and decisively." He paused, letting the words sink in. The investors were listening more intently now, but Danny knew the real test was still to come. "I'm not asking you to take a leap of faith," Danny continued, his voice gaining strength. "I'm asking you to take the next step toward a profitable future where you not only survive but thrive. With Trump's backing, we have the expertise to navigate this uncertainty and turn it into an opportunity for growth." There was a long silence. Danny felt his palms sweat, his heart racing. He had said everything he could, but now it was up to them. Finally, Wexler spoke. "You're right about one thing, Mitchell. The market is volatile, but you've convinced us that you have the strategy and the drive to make this work. We're willing to give you a chance." Danny's heart skipped a beat. "So, we have a deal?" "Yes," Wexler said, nodding. "But understand this, Mitchell. This is a risk. We're taking a chance on you, and we expect results." Danny felt a surge of relief and triumph wash over him. It wasn't a perfect victory, but it was enough. The deal was his. Later that evening, Danny called Trump to deliver the news. "Mr. Trump," Danny said, his voice steady, "the deal is done. They're in." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line before Trump responded. "Good work, Mitchell." Trump's voice was low, but there was a note of approval in it. "You've earned your place here. But remember, this is just the beginning. Don't get complacent. There's always someone else ready to take your spot." Danny knew Trump's words were a warning, but they were also a compliment. He had made it, for now, but the path ahead was still uncertain. And in this world, the only guarantee was that things would keep getting harder. Danny had passed one test, but there would be many more to come. As Danny basked in the glow of his first real success, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just around the corner. Would he be able to handle the pressure of this cutthroat world, or would it eventually consume him? Only time would tell. Danny sat at his desk late into the night, the glow of his computer screen casting long shadows across the room. The deal with Wexler's company had been finalized, but the victory felt fleeting. Trump had made it clear that this success wasn't the end. It was just the beginning, and Danny had already started to feel the pressure of what came next. He glanced at his phone, still buzzing with messages. Greg had texted him several times that evening, asking for updates. Trump was pleased, but Danny knew that was just part of the game. Everyone around him was always playing the same game, and no one ever truly rested on their laurels for long. He couldn't afford to think of himself as having made it, not yet. It was then that his phone rang. The name on the screen made his stomach drop. "Trump." "Mitchell." Trump's voice echoed through the line, as sharp as ever. "I need to see you. Now." Danny stood up, his heart pounding. "Of course, Mr. Trump. I'll be there in 10, 15 minutes later, Danny was stepping into the elevator of Trump Tower once again, his mind racing. He had hoped for a bit of a breather, but that was never going to happen. There was always something else, something bigger, something that required more effort and sacrifice. As the elevator doors opened, Danny made his way to the private office where Trump was waiting. The walls, covered in lavish portraits and gold-framed accolades, seemed to close in on him as he entered. Trump looked up from his desk as Danny walked in. His expression was unreadable, but there was something about his demeanor that made Danny's nerves spike. Something wasn't right. "Mitchell," Trump said, his voice low. "We've got a problem." Danny took a deep breath, already feeling the weight of the situation settle into his chest. "What kind of problem?" Trump leaned back in his chair, his eyes locking onto Danny's. "The deal with Wexler's company? It's been compromised. A leak, Mitchell. Someone on our side has been talking to the press. If we don't handle this fast, it's going to blow up in our faces." Danny's mind raced. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough," Trump replied, his voice hardening. "The press is already starting to catch wind of the negotiations. We can't let this leak any further. I need someone I can trust to fix this." Danny nodded, feeling the blood drain from his face. "I'll take care of it, Mr. Trump. I'll find out who's responsible." Trump's gaze softened for a brief moment, but the harshness returned quickly. "Good. But remember, Mitchell, this isn't just about stopping the leak. It's about making sure this never happens again. Whoever did this needs to be dealt with. Harshly. I don't care how you do it. Just get it done." As Danny left Trump Tower, his mind was spinning. A leak? He had barely been able to enjoy the victory from the deal, and now he was faced with yet another crisis. His phone buzzed again. It was Greg. "Greg, everything okay?" Danny didn't have time to waste. He quickly typed back, "Danny, not exactly. The deal's been compromised. Trump wants me to find out who leaked it." "Greg, shit. That's bad. You know what this means, right?" "Danny, yeah. I'll figure it out. Who do you think it could be?" There was a brief pause before Greg responded. "Greg, could be anyone. Trust no one. The higher up you go, the more people have a reason to take you down. Just be careful." Danny felt a wave of unease wash over him. He had known the business world was cutthroat, but this felt different. This wasn't just a deal gone wrong. This was personal. Someone had betrayed them, and it wasn't just about the leak anymore. It was about power. Whoever was behind this was playing a game, and Danny had no idea what the rules were. The next morning, Danny gathered his team for an emergency meeting. He needed to assess the situation and figure out where the leak had come from. If he could trace it back to the source, he might be able to salvage the deal. But Trump's demands weighed heavily on him. He couldn't afford to fail, not after everything he'd been through. "All right, listen up," Danny began, addressing his team. "There's been a leak. Someone on our side has been talking to the press, and Trump wants us to fix it fast." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the gravity of the situation. "I need everyone's full attention," Danny continued. "We need to identify the source of the leak, and we need to do it quietly. No one can know we're investigating this. Understand?" Nods from around the room. "We'll start by going through all recent communications, emails, texts, phone calls, anything that could lead us to the person responsible. Trust no one. If anyone seems out of place, we'll deal with it. But we can't waste any time." His team dispersed, and Danny immediately started going through records of recent meetings and communications. Every lead he followed felt like a dead end, but he knew he had to keep pushing. Someone in this circle was responsible. Then, as the day wore on, a small breakthrough came. One of the analysts on the team, Lisa, had noticed something strange in the logs from a meeting 2 days before the leak. There was an unusual pattern in the phone calls from someone on the team, Freddie, a junior associate who had been assigned to help with the deal. Danny's stomach sank as he reviewed the details. Freddie had been communicating with someone outside the organization in the days leading up to the leak. It wasn't concrete proof yet, but it was a lead. That evening, Danny called Freddie into his office. "Freddie," Danny began, keeping his tone even, "I need to ask you about some recent communications." Freddie's face went pale. "What do you mean? I don't know what you're talking about." Danny ignored the defensive tone. "I've seen the phone logs. There's been some communication with an external party. Can you explain that? Freddie shifted nervously in his seat. Look, I didn't mean to. I didn't. Freddie, Danny cut him off, his voice hardening. You're either with us or you're against us. There's no middle ground. Now tell me who you were talking to. For a moment, Freddie said nothing. Then, his voice barely above a whisper, he spoke. It wasn't supposed to go this far. I was just trying to get ahead. I didn't think it would blow up like this. Danny leaned forward. Who were you talking to, Freddie? Who were you trying to help? Freddie hesitated, and then finally said, I talked to someone from Wexler's side. They offered me a deal. They said they'd back me if I helped them get intel on Trump's side. I didn't think they'd actually leak the information. I swear, I didn't. Danny's mind raced. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a calculated move. Freddie had been compromised, and now he had to decide what to do with this information. Later that evening, Danny called Greg for advice. I've got him, Greg. Freddie was behind the leak. He was working with Wexler's people. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before Greg spoke. Mitchell, you did well, but this is far from over. You've got to handle this the right way. Trump won't tolerate any weakness. You know what needs to be done. Danny swallowed hard. He did know what needed to be done, and he hated that it had come to this. But in this world, there was no room for mercy. Yeah, Danny said, his voice resolute. I know. In the ruthless world Danny had entered, loyalty was everything. And now, as he stood on the edge of a decision that could make or break his future, he realized the price of ambition was more than just the deals. It was the personal sacrifices, the betrayals, and the shadows that would follow him for as long as he played the game. Danny couldn't sleep that night. The weight of Freddie's betrayal sat heavy on his chest, gnawing at him. He'd seen it coming in a way. In this business, trust was a luxury, one that was easily bought and sold. But to have it come from someone so close to him, someone he had worked with day in and day out, made it all the more bitter. The following morning, as the sun crept over the horizon, Danny found himself pacing the floor of his apartment, still wrestling with the decision he needed to make. He had a choice. He could expose Freddie and let the chips fall where they may, or he could bury the truth and let Freddie go free, hoping it wouldn't come back to haunt him. Trump had made his position clear. There was no room for mistakes, no tolerance for betrayal. If Freddie was involved in the leak, he couldn't just walk away unscathed. But Danny had to wonder, if he sacrificed Freddie now, what would it cost him in the long run? Was loyalty only a weakness in a world like this? Or was it the one thing that could save him from being consumed by the same ruthlessness that had claimed so many others before him? His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Greg. Greg, what's the play? Freddie's dead weight now. Don't waste time on him. Trump won't be pleased if you don't handle it fast. Danny stared at the screen, his fingers hovering over the keys. Greg was right in a way. Time was of the essence, and Trump had made it clear that weakness was not an option. But part of him wanted to find a way out of this, a way to avoid making a decision that would haunt him. He quickly typed back, Danny, I'm handling it. I'll let you know what happens. The meeting with Freddie was set for that afternoon. Danny had asked him to come to the office, a neutral space, where they could talk face to face. When Freddie walked through the door, he looked pale, nervous, like a cornered animal. He knew what was coming. Danny didn't waste time with pleasantries. Freddie, he began, his voice cold and controlled. I know everything. You were in contact with Wexler's team, weren't you? Freddie's eyes widened in fear. Danny, please, just let me explain. I didn't mean to cause any real damage. It wasn't supposed to go this far. They promised me more if I helped them. I thought I could get ahead, maybe even make something of myself. Danny's expression didn't soften. You don't get to explain this away, Freddie. You betrayed us. You betrayed Trump. And now you're asking for forgiveness? Freddie's eyes darted around, looking for an escape. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought they were on our side. Please, Danny, you've got to understand. I never meant to cause harm. I was just trying to get ahead, trying to secure my future. Danny's stomach twisted with frustration, but he held his ground. It's too late for that now. You've already made your choice, and I'm making mine. Freddie's voice cracked, panic creeping in. No, please. Don't do this. You can't do this to me, Danny. I swear, I won't do it again. Just let me go. I'll fix everything. Oh. Danny interrupted, his tone hard. You can't fix it. You've burned the bridge, Freddie, and you don't get to walk away unscathed. For a long moment, there was silence between them. Freddie's face was a mask of terror, but Danny didn't feel the usual sympathy he might have. The loyalty that he once felt for the kid had been shattered, and in its place was only a cold, necessary decision. Get out, Danny said flatly. Freddie's face crumpled, the realization hitting him hard. He stood up shakily, his body trembling as he gathered his things. He didn't fight it. He couldn't. He knew it was over. As the door closed behind Freddie, Danny leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't been able to bring himself to fire Freddie outright. Not yet. But it was clear that he couldn't let him stay in the company either. The trust had been broken, and there was no coming back from that. Danny pulled out his phone and called Greg. Done, he said when Greg answered. Freddie's out. Greg's voice on the other end was calm, almost approving. Good. Trump won't be happy, but you did what had to be done. Now we move on. Danny let out a long breath, his shoulders sagging slightly. Yeah, I guess that's the hardest part. Moving on. Greg chuckled. This business isn't about feelings, Mitchell. It's about survival. And you did what you had to do. Now focus on the next deal. Danny stared out of the window, his thoughts clouded. Greg's words rang true, but the cost of that moment would linger with him for a long time. In this world, there were no second chances. Once a person was marked as a liability, there was only one path forward. And that path was cold. The next few weeks passed in a blur of high-stakes negotiations, investor meetings, and late-night calls. The leak was contained, and the company had avoided a full-blown scandal, but the tension never quite dissipated. Trump was pleased with Danny's handling of the situation, but Danny could sense the ever-present weight of scrutiny on him. Despite the chaos, there was an unsettling calm about Trump. Danny had been expecting more of a reaction after the leak, but Trump had simply given him a nod of approval and moved on, as if it were just another obstacle to overcome. Maybe that was the key to his success, never letting anything get to him, no matter how intense the pressure became. But Danny couldn't shake the feeling that Trump was playing a deeper game, one that Danny didn't yet fully understand. There were too many variables at play, too many people involved, and Danny had yet to figure out exactly where he stood. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the price of loyalty in this business wasn't just the loss of friends or trust. It was the constant fear of who might betray you next. That evening, as Danny sat alone in his apartment, reflecting on everything that had happened, he heard a soft knock at his door. He wasn't expecting anyone. Cautiously, he opened it. Standing in the doorway was a familiar face, Greg. Thought I'd check in on you, Greg said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. How's everything going? Danny shrugged, trying to appear unaffected. Same as always. Just trying to keep up. Greg leaned against the wall, studying Danny with an unreadable expression. You're thinking too much. You can't afford to do that in this game. You have to act, not hesitate. Danny met Greg's eyes, a sense of unease creeping up his spine. What's your point? Greg's smirk returned. Just making sure you're still sharp. Trump's watching you, and I don't think he's the only one. Danny's mind raced. What are you talking about? Greg's smile faded, his tone serious. You're not just fighting for position, Mitchell. You're fighting for your survival. The people at the top, they don't play nice. And they sure as hell don't forget. So don't get comfortable. As Greg left, Danny was left with a sense of dread that he couldn't shake. It was one thing to survive in the world of business. It was another to survive the games that the truly powerful played. The shadows of betrayal still lingered over Danny, and he knew that every step forward was a step into a deeper, more dangerous world. The price of loyalty was high, but the price of survival was even higher. Danny's phone buzzed with a message from Trump's office as he sat in his apartment, reflecting on Greg's cryptic words. The unsettling feeling lingered in his gut, gnawing at him, but he quickly pushed it aside. There was no time to dwell on doubts. He had a mission, and he couldn't afford to lose focus. Trump's office. Meet me at the penthouse in 1 hour. Urgent. The urgency in the text sent a chill down his spine. Trump rarely contacted him outside of their regular meetings, and when he did, it was always for something critical. An hour later, Danny stepped into the private elevator at Trump Tower, the doors closing with a soft ding. As it ascended, his mind whirled with possibilities. What could Trump possibly want now? The Wexler deal had been handled, Freddie was out of the picture, and the leak had been contained. But Trump was always thinking 5 steps ahead. What did he have in store for Danny? The elevator doors slid open, revealing the penthouse. It was exactly what Danny expected: opulent, bold, and impeccably designed. Trump's personal touch was everywhere, from the gold accents on the walls to the meticulously arranged furniture. But there was something about the atmosphere that felt colder than usual. The air seemed heavier, as if a storm was brewing just out of sight. Trump stood by the large windows, looking out over the city. His back was to Danny, but he didn't need to turn around to give the impression of control. He always had that aura, commanding, untouchable. Danny cleared his throat. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Trump?" Trump finally turned around, his piercing eyes locking onto Danny's. "Sit down," he said, his voice carrying an authority that Danny knew better than to question. Danny took a seat across from Trump, his hands clasped in his lap. Trump didn't immediately speak, instead studying him for what felt like an eternity. Danny resisted the urge to fidget under the scrutiny. Finally, Trump spoke. "I've been watching you closely, Mitchell. You've handled everything well so far, but now we're entering dangerous territory. I'm not sure if you realize it yet, but you've become part of something much bigger than you think." Danny's pulse quickened, but he kept his expression neutral. "What do you mean?" Trump smirked, walking over to a nearby table and pouring himself a drink. "You think you've just been playing the corporate game, right? Getting ahead, closing deals, cutting ties when necessary. But the people you're dealing with, they're not just businessmen. They're players in a much larger game. A game that's been going on for decades." Danny's brow furrowed. "What are you saying?" Trump took a sip of his drink before continuing. "I'm saying you've made your way into a network of power that stretches beyond boardrooms and financials. You've stepped into a world where allegiances aren't just about money, they're about survival. And the higher you climb, the more dangerous it gets. You've been playing the game, Mitchell, but now the game is playing you." Danny's stomach tightened. "Are you saying someone's after me?" Trump didn't answer immediately, his gaze growing even more intense. "I'm saying that you need to start asking yourself some hard questions. Who are you really working for? Who's pulling the strings behind all of this?" Danny's mind raced. Was Trump talking about the business world, or was there something more sinister at play? He had always known that Trump was a master manipulator, but hearing him speak this way left Danny feeling vulnerable, like he had been missing something all along. "Who's pulling the strings, Mr. Trump?" Danny asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Trump's gaze never wavered. "It's not about who, Mitchell. It's about what. Money, power, influence. They all work in ways you don't even begin to understand yet." As the days passed, Danny couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in around him. Trump's warning echoed in his mind, and the tension in the air was palpable. He had to face the fact that he had been living in a bubble, focusing on the business side of things while completely unaware of the forces at play behind the scenes. He started paying more attention to the people around him, the ones he had trusted, the ones who had been with him since the beginning. And it was then that he realized something that made his blood run cold. The lines between friends and enemies were becoming dangerously blurred. 2 days later, Danny found himself in a high-profile meeting with several other top executives. The room was filled with influential individuals, some familiar, some new. They were all there for one purpose: to discuss the next major deal in Trump's empire. But as Danny scanned the room, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this wasn't just a business discussion. There was something more at play here. As the meeting began, Trump took his usual seat at the head of the table, his sharp eyes scanning the room as the others took their places. Danny sat toward the middle, trying to maintain a low profile, but his instincts told him that this wasn't just about securing another deal. "We've got a situation," Trump began, his voice commanding the room's attention. Our competitors are getting more aggressive. They're circling us. But we've got a few moves left that will put us in the driver's seat. Danny leaned forward slightly, listening intently. This was the part he was always eager for, the strategy, the power plays. But something about the way Trump was speaking felt different this time. It was as though the stakes were higher than usual. One of the other executives, a man Danny had seen only a few times before, spoke up. What kind of moves are we talking about? We can't just throw money around anymore. We need something more permanent. Danny's ears perked up at the word permanent. He knew this wasn't just about business anymore. This was about something else, something darker. Trump's eyes narrowed. We need to make an example out of someone. Show them we're not to be messed with. We need a bold statement. And I think Mitchell here has just the right tools to make that happen. Danny's heart skipped a beat. He could feel every pair of eyes in the room turn toward him. The implication was clear. Trump was setting him up for something dangerous. I'm listening, Danny said, his voice calm, though his mind was racing. He had no idea what Trump was suggesting, but he knew it wouldn't be good. Trump's smirk grew, like a predator closing in on its prey. We need someone to fall. Someone who can send a message to our rivals. Someone they can't ignore. Danny's stomach turned. Who are we talking about? Trump's gaze was unyielding. I'm talking about Freddie. The room fell silent. The name hung in the air like a lead weight. Danny's pulse surged, but he kept his composure. Freddie? He repeated, the word tasting bitter in his mouth. He had just kicked Freddie out of the company, and now Trump was asking him to make an example of him? Trump's eyes glinted with cold resolve. Yes, it's time to make sure no one ever forgets what happens when you betray us. Danny couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had made his decision to remove Freddie, but this was something else entirely. He wasn't sure how far he was willing to go, but it seemed that in Trump's world, there was no room for hesitation. The stakes had just been raised to a level Danny had never imagined. As the walls closed in around him, Danny realized that survival in this game came with a price that he might not be willing to pay. The days following the meeting weighed heavily on Danny's conscience. The idea of taking such drastic action against Freddie gnawed at him, but the reality of his situation was unmistakable. Loyalty in this business wasn't a virtue. It was a currency, and like any currency, it could be spent or destroyed. The world Trump played in was ruthless, and there was no room for weakness. But Danny had always prided himself on being different. He had maintained his humanity in a world that often demanded people shed theirs. It was part of what had drawn him to Trump in the first place. Trump was not just a businessman, he was a survivor. And to survive in the world Trump inhabited, Danny knew, you had to be more than just smart. You had to be willing to make sacrifices. The next morning, Danny found himself alone in his office, staring at the city skyline. His phone buzzed on the desk, dragging him back to reality. It was Greg. Greg, Trump's not playing games, Danny. You know what you have to do. Freddie's a liability, and Trump doesn't tolerate those. Danny's fingers hovered over the screen, his mind racing. The message was clear, but it didn't make the decision any easier. He had thought he could handle this world without losing himself, but every move he made seemed to push him further into a corner. The line between right and wrong had blurred so much that he wasn't sure where the truth ended and the lies began. He typed back quickly. Danny, I know. This feels wrong. We're not talking about business anymore, Greg. Greg, this is business, Danny. Don't forget that. You need to think bigger. Trump won't stop, and neither should you. Danny stared at the message, feeling a sense of unease creep over him. The deeper he got into Trump's world, the more he realized that the stakes weren't just about wealth or power. They were about control. And the more control Trump gained, the more Danny felt like he was being pulled into a web he couldn't escape. Later that afternoon, Danny arranged to meet Freddie. He'd been putting it off for days, telling himself that he needed more time. But now the time had come. Trump's orders were clear, and there was no room for hesitation. He had already made the choice, even if he hadn't fully accepted it. Freddie had been living in a small apartment on the outskirts of town since he was let go from the company. Danny had always known Freddie was a bit of a screw-up, but he had also been a loyal friend, until that loyalty had been tested. When Freddie answered the door, His face looked worn and hollow. He had the same nervous energy Danny had seen in him during their early days working together, but now it was accompanied by a palpable sense of fear. "Hey," Danny said, his voice surprisingly soft. "Can I come in?" Freddie stepped back to let him in, his eyes darting between Danny and the floor. "Yeah, sure. I didn't expect to see you. I mean, after everything." Danny didn't waste time. "We need to talk." Freddie shifted uncomfortably but nodded. "Yeah, I figured. Look, Danny, I swear I didn't mean for it to go down like this. I was just trying to get ahead, you know? I thought I could." "I know," Danny interrupted, his tone sharp. "I've heard the excuses, Freddie. You've said it all already. The problem is, I'm not sure you realize the magnitude of what you've done." Freddie's face paled. "What do you mean?" "I told you. I'll fix it. I can make it right, I swear." Danny studied him carefully. There was something about the desperation in Freddie's eyes that made it hard to stay angry. He had been Danny's friend for so long, but at the end of the day, Freddie had made his choice, and now Danny had to make his. "I can't trust you anymore," Danny said quietly. "I can't afford to. And I don't think you understand the position you've put me in. Trump doesn't forget things like this. You've crossed a line, Freddie. And now, so have I." Freddie's eyes widened in realization. No, you can't be serious. You're not going to." Danny looked away, his stomach churning. He didn't want to do this. He didn't want to be the person who turned his back on a friend, but the reality of his situation was undeniable. Trump had made it clear. There were no second chances in this world. "I'm sorry," Danny said, his voice breaking slightly, "but there's nothing left to fix." As he turned to leave, Freddie grabbed his arm, panic rising in his voice. "Danny, please. You have to understand. I never meant it like this. I thought I could. I thought I could get ahead. I didn't know it would ruin everything." Danny jerked his arm away, his heart heavy with guilt. "You've made your choices, Freddie. Now I have to make mine. And I can't keep pretending this doesn't matter." He walked out without another word, the door clicking shut behind him. As he made his way down the stairs, Danny felt like he was suffocating under the weight of his decisions. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. He didn't know what would happen to Freddie, but he knew what would happen to him if he didn't follow through. Trump had warned him about this world. The cold, calculated world where loyalty didn't count for much, where survival meant doing whatever was necessary. And as much as Danny hated it, he knew that in order to survive, he had to shed his past, his morals, everything that had once defined him. But as he stepped into the night, a part of him wondered if he was already too far gone. The days that followed were a blur of meetings, calls, and carefully calculated moves. Danny focused on the task at hand, trying to push the images of Freddie's pleading face from his mind. There was no time for distractions. Trump's plans were moving forward, and Danny had to keep pace. But the unease never left him. It was there in every conversation, every decision. It was a constant reminder that in this world, there were no real friends, just allies and enemies, each interchangeable in the grand scheme of things. One evening, as Danny sat alone in his office, he received a call from Greg. "Greg, you did what you had to do, Mitchell. You know that, right?" Danny's fingers tightened around the phone. He had never been more unsure of anything in his life. "Danny, I don't know, Greg. I'm starting to wonder if I've crossed a line I can't come back from." "Greg, you haven't. You're just getting started. The game's only beginning, Danny. And if you want to stay in it, you have to keep your head in the game. Trust no one, not even yourself." Danny didn't respond. He couldn't. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and as he stared out the window, he realized Greg was right. There was no room for doubt now, only forward. The web of power had drawn him in, and Danny was no longer sure if he was controlling the game, or if the game was controlling him. Danny couldn't shake the feeling that he was no longer in control. The events of the past few days seemed to blur together, each one feeding into the next like a series of dominoes falling in slow motion. He had made the decision to sever ties with Freddie, but with each passing hour, the weight of that decision grew heavier. The line between friend and foe was disappearing, and Danny had no idea who he could trust anymore. Trump's empire was a well-oiled machine, and Danny was just another cog in it. He had done his job, made the hard calls, and played the game by Trump's rules. But now, with Freddie's fate hanging in the balance, Danny couldn't escape the nagging question that had been haunting him. What would it cost him in the end? It had been 3 days since he left Freddie's apartment. Danny hadn't heard from him since, and he wasn't sure if that was a good or bad thing. If Freddie had made it out of whatever trouble Trump's people had put him in, then he was smart enough to lay low. If not, well, Danny didn't want to think about that. But the uneasy feeling in his gut only grew as the hours passed. He kept waiting for a call, either from Trump or someone in his inner circle, telling him what had happened. But nothing came. The silence was deafening. Finally, Danny received the call he'd been dreading. Trump's office. Mitchell, come to the penthouse. We need to discuss Freddie. Danny's stomach lurched. He had no idea what to expect, but he knew it wouldn't be good. He took a deep breath and headed for Trump Tower once again. When he arrived, the same cold, polished atmosphere filled the penthouse. Trump stood by the window, his back to Danny, as usual. But today, there was a sharpness in his posture, a tension in the air that Danny couldn't ignore. Trump wasn't just waiting for him. He was waiting for something. Danny didn't waste any time. What's happened? Where's Freddie? Trump turned slowly, a glint of something unreadable in his eyes. Freddie? Oh, he's taken care of. You don't have to worry about him anymore. Danny's heart skipped a beat. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that was almost suffocating. Taken care of? Danny repeated, trying to keep his voice steady. Trump's lips twisted into a half-smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. You didn't think there wouldn't be consequences, did you? Freddie made his choice, and now he has to live with it, or not. Danny felt a cold chill sweep over him, his mind racing. You had him killed, didn't you? Trump didn't flinch. I didn't say that, Mitchell. But I'm not in the habit of wasting time or resources. Freddie's disappearance is unfortunate, but it was necessary. Danny's blood ran cold. He had known the game was brutal, but he had never imagined it could go this far. This wasn't just business. This wasn't just the usual corporate maneuvering. This was something darker, something Danny wasn't sure he could ever escape. Why tell me this? Danny asked, his voice hoarse. Trump's eyes narrowed. Because you're more involved than you think. You've crossed a line, Mitchell. And you need to understand that there's no going back now. There's no turning back to the world you knew before. You're part of this now, whether you like it or not. The words hit Danny like a punch to the gut. He had crossed a line. He had made choices that were irreversible. And now, no matter what, he was in Trump's world for good. The weight of Trump's words lingered in Danny's mind as he left the penthouse. He had taken a step into a world where consequences were immediate and unforgiving. Freddie's life was gone, and it was his fault. He had made the decision to follow Trump's orders, to trust that this was the only way to survive. But now that he was standing on the other side, looking at the aftermath, he wasn't sure he could live with himself. As he entered his car, Danny's phone buzzed again. It was a message from Greg. Greg, you've done what needed to be done. There's no turning back now. Trump's plans are moving forward, and you're a key part of them. Stay focused. Danny stared at the message, feeling the weight of Greg's words. He was in too deep now. He had crossed a threshold, and there was no going back. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that even if he tried to walk away, he would never truly escape the consequences of his choices. The world Trump operated in didn't let people go once they were in. Once you were marked, you were always part of the game. The days that followed were a blur. Meetings, calls, and the constant hum of activity as Trump's empire expanded. But through it all, Danny felt a growing sense of disconnection. He had lost something inside himself, something he wasn't sure he could ever find again. The hunger for power that had once driven him had been replaced by an emptiness he couldn't explain. The people he had trusted, the friends he had made, they all felt distant now. Everything was a transaction, and Danny was no longer sure who he was playing for. But then, on the 4th day after Freddie's death, something unexpected happened. Danny was sitting in his office, reviewing some documents, when his phone rang. It was an unknown number, but something in his gut told him to answer. Hello? The voice on the other end was familiar, but it took a moment for Danny to place it. "Mitchell, it's Greg." "Greg?" Danny said, sitting up straighter. "Where have you been? I haven't heard from you in days." There was a long pause on the other end. Then Greg's voice came back, quieter than usual. "We need to talk, Danny. This thing with Trump, it's bigger than you think. And it's about to get a lot worse." Danny's heart raced. "What do you mean?" Greg's voice dropped to a whisper. "There's someone else pulling the strings. Trump's not the top dog in this game. Someone else has been controlling him, and now they're coming for you." The world Danny thought he understood was suddenly unraveling. He had made his choices, but the price of power was steeper than he ever imagined. Someone else was controlling the game, and it was clear that no one, no matter how high they climbed, was truly safe. As the realization set in, Danny knew one thing for certain. The game had just begun, and he was in the middle of it. Danny couldn't shake the sensation that the ground beneath him was crumbling. Greg's cryptic warning echoed in his mind, refusing to let him rest. Someone else has been controlling him, and now they're coming for you. It was a chilling thought. Trump, the man Danny had aligned himself with, who had once seemed so powerful, so untouchable, wasn't the mastermind? He had assumed, like everyone else, that Trump was at the top of the chain. But now, it seemed there was an even more dangerous player in the shadows, someone pulling the strings, orchestrating a much larger game. That night, Danny couldn't sleep. He paced around his apartment, the weight of Greg's words pressing on his chest. What was the next move? What was the play in this treacherous game? If Trump wasn't the power behind it all, then who was? And why hadn't he known? His mind raced in circles, trying to come up with answers, trying to piece together any hint that would give him a clue. He thought about the people in Trump's circle, men and women who always seemed to be a step ahead, always in control. Was there someone among them who was the true power? Or was it an unseen entity, an organization so covert that even Trump had to answer to them? One thing was clear. Greg knew more than he was letting on, but he wasn't ready to reveal it. Danny had to find out more, and that meant getting to Greg before he disappeared into the same abyss that seemed to be swallowing everyone around him. The following morning, Danny decided to act. He couldn't wait for Greg to reach out. He needed answers now. He called his most trusted associate, Jake. Jake wasn't just a colleague. He was someone Danny knew he could count on when things got messy. Over the years, Jake had proven time and time again that he was capable, resourceful, and above all, loyal. If anyone could help him get to the bottom of this, it was Jake. "Danny, Jake, I need you to track down Greg. Now." "Jake, what's going on, Danny? Why the urgency?" "Danny, I think we're being played, and I need to know who's behind all of this. Trump's not the top player, Jake. There's someone else pulling the strings." There was a moment of silence on the other end. Danny could almost hear Jake processing the information. "Jake, all right, I'll get on it. But you need to be careful, Danny. If Greg's right, we could be dealing with something a lot bigger than just Trump." "Danny, I know. But right now, I don't have a choice. I need to know who's running this show." Jake set to work immediately, digging into Greg's last known whereabouts and any connections he might have had. Danny, meanwhile, tried to carry on with his regular duties, but it was impossible to shake the feeling that his life had taken a turn from which there was no return. Every deal, every handshake, every word spoken now felt like part of a carefully crafted plan, and Danny was a pawn in it. Hours passed, and Danny barely managed to keep his focus. The wait was excruciating, but finally, Jake called back. "Jake, I've got something. Greg's been meeting with people outside of Trump's usual circle. There's a group, some sort of covert organization. They don't just operate in the U.S. They have international reach." "Danny, what group? Who are they?" "Jake, I'm still trying to trace it back, but I'm telling you, this is big. It's not just about business or money. They're involved in things we can't even imagine. It's like a shadow government." The words hit Danny like a cold wave. A shadow government? It sounded like something out of a thriller novel, not reality. But then again, everything about this world felt unreal lately. The line between fiction and truth had been blurring for too long. "Danny, find out everything you can, Jake. No matter what it takes." As Danny hung up the phone, The weight of the situation crashed down on him. Trump had never been the mastermind. He had simply been a player in a much larger game, a game that was now closing in on him. If there was a shadow government running the show, who were they? What did they want? And how far would they go to protect their interests? He didn't have the answers yet, but one thing was certain. He had to get to Greg before it was too late. The cryptic warnings, the silence. Greg knew something, and he was the key to understanding everything. But Greg had also been deep in the game. He had gone further than Danny ever had, and now it seemed that Greg had paid the price for his knowledge. Danny could only hope that Greg was still alive and willing to talk. The next few days were a blur of tension and uncertainty. Danny couldn't focus on anything else. Every phone call, every message felt like it was part of a larger puzzle that he wasn't equipped to solve. The weight of knowing that Trump wasn't the final authority in this game made his situation all the more dangerous. If the shadow government wanted him out, there was nowhere to hide. Finally, Jake called again. "Jake, I found Greg. He's alive, but he's in hiding. He's scared, Danny. He said he'll meet with you, but only in a secure location." Danny's heart skipped a beat. "Where?" "Jake, I'll send you the address. Be careful, Danny. This is deeper than we thought." The location was an old warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Danny's mind raced as he drove there. This wasn't just a meeting, it was a reckoning. Everything had led him to this moment, and whether or not he was ready, he was about to learn the truth. The truth about Trump, the shadow government, and the role he had unwittingly played in this high-stakes game of power. When he arrived, the warehouse looked abandoned. There were no cars in sight, no signs of life. He parked his car in a dark corner, his senses alert as he stepped out and approached the entrance. Inside, the place was dimly lit, the faint smell of oil and dust hanging in the air. It felt like the kind of place where secrets were buried, and Danny was about to uncover them. He entered cautiously, his eyes scanning the room. And then he saw him. Greg was sitting at a table in the corner, his face drawn and weary. He looked up as Danny approached, his expression unreadable. "You came," Greg said, his voice tinged with both relief and fear. "I didn't think you would." Danny took a seat across from him, his mind racing. "You've been hiding from them, haven't you?" Greg nodded. "They're watching everything. Trump's not the one who controls this. There's someone else. Someone even more powerful than him. And now they want you too." Danny's pulse quickened. "Who are they, Greg?" Greg leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You're about to find out. But once you do, there's no going back." The pieces were starting to fall into place, but what Danny didn't know was that the hardest part of the game was only just beginning. Danny's pulse hammered in his ears as he sat across from Greg in the shadowy warehouse. The air between them was thick with the weight of unspoken truths, each word hanging like a heavy curtain over their conversation. Greg had been running, hiding, for days, and now, it seemed, the moment of reckoning had finally arrived. "You're saying Trump's just a pawn?" Danny asked, his voice low but urgent. He couldn't quite grasp what Greg was implying, but the implications were enough to chill him to the core. Greg's eyes flickered nervously around the warehouse. "Not just Trump. It's bigger than that. Much bigger." He paused, as if weighing how much to reveal. His voice lowered further. "The people behind all of this, they've been controlling things from the shadows for years. They've manipulated everything, the media, the economy, even governments. They're everywhere, Danny." Danny felt a cold chill run down his spine. His world had always been about power, about climbing to the top, but he'd never imagined that someone could be pulling the strings from such a distance. It sounded like a conspiracy theory, something out of a spy novel, but Greg wasn't a man prone to exaggeration. "So, who are they? What do they want with me?" Danny asked, trying to steady his breathing. It was getting harder to keep the panic at bay. He was in deeper than he ever thought he would be. Greg hesitated before answering, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're a group, Danny. Some people call them the collective. It's not just one person. It's a network of the most powerful individuals in the world. People with resources, connections, and influence beyond anything you can imagine. They control everything. They make things happen, from wars to economic crashes. And Trump? He's just their mouthpiece. Danny was reeling. The idea that there was a global shadow network controlling world events seemed far-fetched, but he couldn't deny what he was hearing. The strange events of the past few months, the way things had shifted in his life, were all adding up. This wasn't just about Freddie or Trump. It was something much more dangerous. Why are they after me? Danny asked again, his voice strained. What do they want with a guy like me? Greg's face grew darker, his eyes flickering nervously. Because you're in the way, Danny. You're too close to the action. You've made yourself valuable to Trump, and now that makes you valuable to them. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping even lower. They know you've crossed lines. They know you've made decisions that can't be undone. You're marked. And if you don't play by their rules, you won't just be eliminated. You'll disappear. Like Freddie. Danny's stomach churned at the thought. He could see it now, the threads of manipulation, the games being played from behind the scenes. All along, he had thought he was the one controlling his fate, making moves to secure his future, but now he understood that the cards had already been stacked against him. And they weren't just watching him. They were preparing to take him down. Greg stood up abruptly, pacing the length of the room. You need to leave, Danny. Go underground. Cut all ties. Sever everything. If you stay with Trump, if you stay in this game, they'll come for you. And they won't stop until you're nothing. Danny's mind was a whirlwind. He couldn't fathom what Greg was saying. Go underground? Cut all ties? He was already too deep in the game. His life was intertwined with Trump's empire, with the people he had trusted. And yet, the realization that he had no control over the situation was sinking in fast. How do I even begin to get out of this? Danny muttered, more to himself than to Greg. I can't just walk away. You can, Greg said urgently, but you have to act fast. They're already watching you, Danny. You don't have much time. If you want to survive, you need to disappear. Danny's mind raced as Greg's words sank in. He was staring at the precipice of a decision that would change his life forever. On one side, there was safety, freedom from the web that had ensnared him, a chance to rebuild his life, to escape the horrors of the world he had willingly entered. But on the other side, there was power, wealth, and the dark allure of Trump's empire, a life that promised riches and influence. The thought of walking away from it all, of abandoning everything he had worked for, was terrifying. But the consequences of staying in this game, of continuing to dance with the shadowy figures pulling the strings, were far more terrifying. Danny stood up, pacing the warehouse floor. His mind felt numb, his thoughts running in every direction. Greg had given him the truth, but now Danny had to decide what to do with it. How do I know you're not just trying to play me? Danny finally asked, his voice hoarse. Greg stopped pacing and turned to face him. There was no hesitation in his eyes, no sign of doubt. I'm telling you the truth, Danny. This isn't about me. It's about you. I'm trying to help you. But if you stay in this game, you'll never be free. If you want out, you need to disappear. Cut all ties. Go off the grid. Danny's mind raced. He couldn't just disappear. He had built his life on this network, on the power he had amassed, on the people who owed him favors. But as Greg's words echoed in his mind, something shifted inside him. For the first time, he considered the possibility of a life outside this web of manipulation. A life where he wasn't just a pawn in someone else's game. I need to think, Danny said, his voice thick with emotion. I need to figure out what to do. Greg nodded, his expression grim. You don't have much time. The clock's ticking, Danny. They'll be coming for you soon. As Danny left the warehouse and stepped into the night air, the weight of his decision hung heavy over him. The streets seemed darker than before, the city's bright lights casting long shadows that reminded him of the games being played in the underworld. He had come so far, climbed so high, only to realize that everything he thought he knew was a lie. But as the cold wind hit his face, Danny knew one thing. There was no turning back now. The decision he made in the next few hours would determine his fate. Stay and face the consequences of his actions, or disappear into the shadows and risk losing everything. The world he had known had just collapsed around him, and now, in the quiet darkness of the city, Danny had to decide. Would he fight for his survival, or walk away from everything he had ever known? The choice was his. And no matter which path he took, there would be no easy way out. Danny didn't sleep that night. His mind raced like a runaway train, spinning with endless thoughts about what Greg had told him. He walked around his apartment, pacing back and forth, unable to sit still. Each time he tried to lie down, the image of Freddie, dead, gone without a trace, flashed in his mind. He knew that the moment he made the wrong move, he too would disappear, erased from everything and everyone he knew. His phone buzzed, interrupting his spiraling thoughts. It was Jake. Jake, I've got something on that collective you asked about. Danny's heart skipped a beat. He had almost forgotten about Jake's search. What do you have? Danny asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Jake, it's not much, but it's a start. I've traced some of their transactions. High-level financial dealings, black market trades, influence in several major industries across the globe. They don't leave a footprint, but the scope of their operations is massive. It's like they have fingers in everything. Banks, media, politics, you name it. Danny, do you have any names? There was a pause before Jake responded. Jake, I've got a few leads. But this is big, Danny. Bigger than we thought. These people don't just play the game. They control it. Danny's mind buzzed. I know, he muttered to himself. I know. Jake, listen, if you want to keep digging, I can help. But you're going to need more than just information. You'll need to make some powerful allies. This isn't something you can handle on your own. Danny rubbed his face, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. All right, let's see what you've got. I'll need everything you can find. He hung up and stood in front of the mirror for a long moment, staring at his reflection. The man looking back at him was no longer the one who walked confidently into rooms full of powerful people. This man had doubt in his eyes, a fear that had settled deep within him. But he couldn't let that show. Not yet. He needed to get answers. He needed to know how far this web of power stretched, and more importantly, how he could escape it. The game had changed, and Danny was no longer playing by the same rules. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about taking back control. The next day, Danny met with Jake in person, away from prying eyes. They chose a quiet cafe in a nondescript part of town, a place where they could talk without being overheard. Jake had brought a laptop and several files, his expression tense. You're not going to like this, Jake said as he slid the laptop across the table. The more I dig, the more I realize this thing is bigger than just some underground syndicate. It's global, Danny. Whoever's at the top of this network is untouchable. Danny didn't flinch. He had suspected as much. He flipped open the laptop, scanning the documents and files Jake had compiled. These people are everywhere, Danny murmured. They've got their hands in everything. Jake nodded. Yeah, but that's not the worst part. The worst part is that they're untouchable. Whoever they are, they've managed to stay hidden in plain sight. They don't just operate in the shadows. They own the shadows. If we're going to expose them, we're going to have to go deep. Really deep. Danny sat back in his chair, processing the information. The collective, as Greg had called them, were everywhere, and they controlled everything. Banks, governments, corporations, nothing was out of their reach. They were the unseen force that kept the world turning, pulling strings behind the scenes. He had once been a part of their game, a player in their carefully constructed world. But now, he realized he was the one being played. And worse, they were coming for him. How do we take them down? Danny asked, the question feeling hollow in his throat. How could one man, one very exposed, very scared man, bring down an organization like this? Jake shook his head. We can't take them down, Danny. Not directly. But there is a way to disrupt their game. If we can get to the right people, expose just enough of their operations, we might be able to make them vulnerable. It's a long shot, but it's the only shot we've got. Danny clenched his fists. He wasn't about to let these people win. He wouldn't let them erase him, like they had done to Freddie, like they were trying to do now. Who's behind it? Danny asked. Do we have any idea who's at the top of this? Jake hesitated. He pulled up a file and slid it across to Danny. This is what I've been able to dig up. We think one name is leading the charge, a man by the name of Harold Hargrove. The name didn't mean anything to Danny, but there was something about it, something that triggered a faint memory. He stared at the name for a few moments, trying to place it. Harold Hargrove, Danny repeated, his voice flat. Who is he? Jake leaned in. Hargrove is a ghost. The man is known in certain circles, but no one really knows where he came from or what he does. He's been involved in some of the world's most powerful financial deals, but he never seems to get his hands dirty. No one has ever been able to tie him to anything directly. But they say he's the one calling the shots in the collective. Danny's heart skipped a beat. Hargrove was a name from the past, a shadow he had heard whispers about, but never had the courage to confront. If Hargrove was the one behind everything, then Danny had just stumbled onto a war he wasn't prepared to fight. I need to meet him, Danny said, his voice low and determined. We need to get to him before he gets to us. Jake's face hardened. You don't understand, Danny. This guy doesn't meet with anyone. People don't just meet Harold Hargrove. They disappear. Danny knew Jake was right, but at that moment, he didn't care. He was past the point of fear. There was no turning back now. His life, his fate, his very survival depended on finding this man, on taking the fight to him before he became another forgotten name in the wake of the collective's control. I'll find a way, Danny said, standing up and closing his laptop with a determined snap. I'll find him, and we'll bring him down. As he left the cafe, the weight of the task ahead loomed over him. Every step he took felt heavier than the last, but Danny was resolute. The path to freedom was no longer about escaping. It was about fighting back. In the end, it wasn't just about surviving the game. It was about changing the rules, and Danny was about to rewrite them. The days that followed were a blur of action and uncertainty. Danny moved quickly, using every resource he had to track down Harold Hargrove and uncover more about the collective's inner workings. The more he dug, the more he realized how tightly the web of power was woven around him. Every step he took seemed to lead him deeper into a maze where the walls closed in with each turn. Jake had been a valuable asset, gathering intelligence and tracking down leads that would have taken Danny weeks, if not months, to uncover. They had learned that Hargrove was more than just a shadowy figure. He was a genius strategist, a man who had orchestrated financial and political movements across the globe, always staying out of sight. People whispered his name, but no one could confirm anything concrete about him. He was the puppet master, and the strings he pulled stretched further than Danny had ever imagined. One night, as Danny sat at his desk in his apartment, scrolling through a mountain of documents Jake had sent him, his phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. Unknown, I know what you're looking for. Meet me tomorrow, 2 p.m., at the old pier. Come alone. Danny's stomach churned as he read the message. He didn't recognize the number, and the message was cryptic enough to send a shiver down his spine. It could be a trap, he knew that, but it could also be the break he had been waiting for. If someone knew something about Hargrove, if they had information that could expose the collective, he couldn't afford to miss the chance. He spent the rest of the night preparing, going over his escape plans, and making sure his phone was secure. He wasn't taking any chances. The stakes were higher now than they had ever been before. The next day, Danny arrived at the old pier just before 2 p.m. The place was eerily quiet, the kind of desolate spot that only seemed to exist in the margins of the city. The air smelled of salt water and decay, the wooden planks creaking beneath his feet as he made his way toward the designated meeting spot. His mind was racing, every possible outcome flashing through his head. He wasn't sure who he was about to meet, but one thing was certain. This person knew something crucial. As the clock ticked toward 2, a figure emerged from the shadows. Danny's heart skipped a beat. The man was tall, dressed in a dark coat, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. He moved with a quiet confidence, as if he were accustomed to dealing in secrecy. "You're Danny, I assume?" the man asked, his voice low and calm. Danny didn't answer immediately, his instincts on high alert. "Who are you?" he finally asked, his voice steady but edged with suspicion. The man paused for a moment, his eyes glinting with a cold intensity. "Let's just say I'm someone who knows you're looking for Harold Hargrove, and I know you don't have much time." He glanced around nervously, as if checking for anyone who might be watching. "You're in deep, Danny. You don't know what you're up against." Danny took a step forward, his hands clenched at his sides. "I'm not afraid." I need to know where he is. I need to get to him before it's too late. The man smirked, but there was a hint of genuine concern in his expression. You think you're ready to take on Hargrove? You don't have a clue what you're dealing with. He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a near whisper. This isn't just about a man. It's about an empire. And if you're not careful, you'll end up just like Freddy. Danny's blood ran cold at the mention of Freddy's name. He had been trying to block out the memory of his friend's violent end, but hearing it again brought it all rushing back. Why are you telling me this? Danny demanded. If you know something, you need to give it to me now. The man hesitated, as though weighing the decision. After a long pause, he finally spoke. I'm not here to help you, Danny. I'm here to warn you. Hargrove isn't just pulling strings behind the scenes. He's got people everywhere. He knows everything, and he's already watching you. If you're looking for a way out, you're too late. Danny clenched his fists. He had known the risks from the beginning, but hearing it from someone else made the situation feel even more real, more dangerous. What do you want from me? Danny asked, his voice hard. The man's eyes narrowed. I'm offering you a choice, he said, pulling out a small, folded piece of paper. He handed it to Danny without a word, then turned to walk away. Danny unfolded the paper. It contained a set of coordinates, followed by a single line of text. The meeting is set. Come alone. Danny's heart raced as he stared at the coordinates. Whoever this man was, he was giving him a direct path to something. Someone. That could change everything. This wasn't just a warning anymore. This was an opportunity. He knew the risks. The collective's reach was vast, and Hargrove was a mastermind who wouldn't hesitate to make Danny disappear. But there was no turning back now. The truth was closer than ever, and if he didn't act fast, he might never get another chance. That night, Danny stood at the entrance to a secluded building on the outskirts of the city. The coordinates had led him here, and now, he was on the verge of the most dangerous meeting of his life. The darkness of the night seemed to press in around him, the faint hum of the city in the distance a constant reminder of the world that was slipping further and further out of his control. He took a deep breath, then pushed open the door. Inside, the room was dimly lit, filled with shadows that seemed to move and twist with every step he took. He could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching him, studying him, waiting for him to make a move. And then, from the shadows, a voice spoke. Welcome, Danny, the voice said, its tone cold and calculating. You've come far, but the real game is just beginning. Danny's pulse quickened as he took another step into the room. This was it. The moment that would determine whether he could survive the storm that was coming. He had no idea who was speaking or what lay ahead, but one thing was certain. He was no longer playing by the rules. This was his fight now, and it was only just beginning. The door clicked shut behind Danny with an ominous thud, the sound echoing through the room like the finality of a closing chapter. The dimly lit space felt suffocating, and for a moment, all he could hear was the sound of his own breath. He had no idea who was waiting for him in the shadows, but his instinct screamed at him to remain calm. Every step, every word, every glance could be the one that sealed his fate. Who are you? Danny's voice was steady, though his heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, every muscle in his body tense, ready for whatever came next. A figure emerged from the darkness, a man, dressed sharply in a tailored suit, his face obscured by the dim lighting. His posture was confident, calculated, as if he were in complete control of the situation. Danny couldn't place him, but something about the man's presence felt all too familiar. Names have power, Danny, the man replied, his voice smooth, almost disinterested. But they're also fleeting. In a world like ours, names don't matter as much as the ones who control the game. Do you understand? Danny's brow furrowed. I'm not here for riddles. I need answers. I'm looking for Harold Hargrove. If you know something about him, then I suggest you start talking. The man's lips curled into a half-smile, as if Danny's urgency amused him. He motioned to a chair in front of him. Sit down, Danny. We'll talk. But first, understand this. You are in a very dangerous place. There are forces at work here, one's far bigger than you. And Hargrove, well, he's at the heart of it all. Danny didn't sit. His instincts told him that sitting would put him at a disadvantage. "I'm not playing games," he said, his voice hardening. "I've already lost too much. I'm not walking away empty-handed." The man's smile faltered for just a second, but it quickly returned, tinged with a sense of approval. "Good. I like people who are willing to do whatever it takes." He moved closer, his steps slow and deliberate. "But you need to understand something important. You're not just up against Hargrove. The collective isn't just a network of criminals. It's much, much worse. They control everything. And right now, they're controlling you." Danny's grip tightened on his phone, the only tool he had left to protect himself. "What are you talking about?" The man's eyes gleamed, sharp and calculating. "You think you're in control, Danny. You think that by finding Hargrove, you'll be able to expose everything. But you're wrong. You've already been ensnared. They've been watching you for a long time, and they know everything about you. Every step you take, every move you make, they've been 3 steps ahead." Danny swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had been feeling it, the constant sense of being watched, the feeling that his every move was being scrutinized. He had tried to push it aside, to focus on finding Hargrove, but now it hit him full force. The collective wasn't just a group of powerful players in the shadows. They were orchestrating his every move. "You're a pawn in their game, Danny," the man continued. "And the sooner you accept that, the better. Hargrove isn't the one you should be worried about. It's the ones who pull his strings, the ones you'll never see coming." Danny's mind spun. If what the man said was true, he wasn't just up against Hargrove. He was up against an entire invisible system, a machine that had been operating in the shadows for decades. And now, he was caught in its gears. "You said you had answers," Danny said, his voice growing sharper. "Then tell me what I need to know. Who's behind it all? Who's controlling the collective?" The man took a long breath, as if considering Danny's words carefully. "You really want to know, don't you?" he asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. "Fine. But know this. Once you learn the truth, there's no going back. You can't unsee what's been hidden in plain sight." Danny's pulse quickened. "Tell me." The man's smile widened, and he took a step back, his eyes never leaving Danny's. "It's not just one person. It's a group. An elite group that's been controlling the world for centuries, shaping the course of history, manipulating governments, economies, everything. They're the real power behind the throne. And Hargrove? He's just their face, their public figurehead." Danny felt a chill run down his spine. "Who are they?" The man paused for a moment before answering. "They're called the Covenant." Danny's mind raced, trying to process the information. "The Covenant?" he repeated, feeling the weight of the name. "Who's in it? How do I get to them?" The man's smile faded, replaced with a look of something that resembled pity. "You don't. Not directly, anyway. The Covenant operates through proxies, through people like Hargrove, people who carry out their orders without even knowing who they're working for. They pull the strings, control the narrative. They've got their hands in everything: politics, finance, media, even the military. They control it all." Danny's mind spun. This was bigger than he had ever imagined. The people behind the collective weren't just criminals. They were architects of a new world order. And Danny was just one small cog in their massive machine. "You're not getting out of this," the man said, his voice cold and final. "No one does. The Covenant is like a shadow. It follows you, it watches you, and no matter how far you run, it's always one step behind. You've been marked, Danny. They know what you're doing, and they'll stop at nothing to make sure you don't succeed." Danny's chest tightened as the weight of the man's words sank in. The truth was becoming clearer, but it only raised more questions. If the Covenant was truly behind everything, how could he possibly fight them? How could he take on an entire network of unseen power when every move he made was being watched? The man saw the doubt in Danny's eyes and took a step forward. "But there's one thing you can do," he said, his voice softer now, almost conspiratorial. "There's one way you can strike back." Danny looked at him, his desperation rising. "What is it?" The man leaned in close, his voice barely a whisper. "Find the key to their operation, the one thing that could bring them all down. But be careful. The closer you get, the more dangerous it becomes. They won't let you get away with this. Not without a fight. Danny's heart raced. He had no choice now but to keep going. He had already come too far to turn back. If there was a way to take down the Covenant, he had to find it, no matter what the cost. Where do I start? Danny asked, his voice determined. The man smirked. That's for you to figure out. But trust me, once you start, there's no turning back. As the man melted back into the shadows, Danny stood alone in the dark room, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. The road ahead was treacherous, but he wasn't turning back. Not now. He would find the key, and he would bring the Covenant down, one way or another. The man's words echoed in Danny's mind as he walked out of the building and into the cold, crisp air of the night. The weight of what he had learned, the existence of the Covenant, the true puppet masters behind the collective, settled heavily on his shoulders. It was like staring into the abyss, knowing that there was no going back. The world he had known had just shifted. What had seemed like a simple search for answers had grown into something far more dangerous, something far more complex. He could feel their eyes on him now. The Covenant, Hargrove, the collective. They were all connected, and they were all watching. Every move he made would be scrutinized, every step calculated. But he couldn't stop. He had already crossed the line, and there was no turning back now. Not after Freddie. Not after everything he had lost. If the Covenant was as powerful as the man had suggested, Danny knew it wasn't just about taking down Hargrove. It was about taking down an entire system, a machine that had been quietly running the world for decades. Danny's mind raced as he walked down the dimly lit streets, trying to make sense of it all. The more he thought about it, the more it seemed like a puzzle with pieces scattered across the globe. But where to start? Who could he trust? His phone buzzed again, interrupting his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. Jake had texted. "Jake, I've got some info. It's not much, but it's a start. Meet me tomorrow. Same place." Danny quickly typed a reply. "Danny, I'm on my way." The next morning, Danny met Jake in the same small cafe they'd used as a meeting spot in the past. The place was quiet, the clinking of coffee cups and hushed voices creating a comfortable ambience. But Danny couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in. Every time the door opened, every time someone walked past, he felt like it could be the end of his search. The Covenant was everywhere, and they knew who he was. Jake was already seated in the corner, his face tense. He hadn't seen Danny in over a week, but he looked as if he'd aged years in that short time. His usual sharp demeanor was gone, replaced with a weariness that spoke volumes. "Got something?" Danny asked as he slid into the seat across from Jake. Jake glanced around, lowering his voice. "I do, but it's not much. We've been digging into Hargrove's finances, looking for any sign of irregular activity. Turns out, he's been laundering money through a series of offshore accounts. And there's one name that keeps coming up, a name that could lead us right to him." Danny leaned in, his heart rate picking up. "What name?" Jake hesitated before speaking, his eyes flicking nervously around the cafe. "Catherine Halloran." Danny's mind immediately began racing. The name was unfamiliar, but it didn't take long for him to put it together. Halloran. He had heard it before, only it hadn't registered at the time. The name was tied to one of the most influential financial firms in the world, a firm that had connections to everything from government contracts to high-level investments. But what was her connection to Hargrove? Was she another puppet in the game? Or was she a part of the Covenant itself? "Who is she?" Danny asked, his voice low. "Halloran's the CEO of a private investment firm," Jake explained. "She's been doing business with Hargrove for years, but here's the kicker. She's connected to the people in the highest positions of power. Political figures, military contracts, the whole 9 yards. The kind of people who can make or break entire economies. If we can get to her, we might be able to get to Hargrove." Danny felt a chill spread through him. Halloran wasn't just a businesswoman. She was a key player in the web of power that stretched far beyond anything Danny had imagined. And she was the lead he needed. If he could find her, get close to her, maybe, just maybe, he could learn something that would lead him to Hargrove. "Where do we start?" Danny asked, his mind already moving ahead to the next step. Jake pulled out a file from his bag, sliding it across the table. "I've got everything we know on her. Locations, connections, even some photos. She's elusive, but not untouchable. If we can get a bead on where she's hiding, we might be able to push her into revealing something useful. Danny grabbed the file and opened it, scanning the details quickly. There were photos of Halloran at various public events, surrounded by a collection of wealthy, powerful people. Her profile was clean, too clean. There were no criminal records, no whispers of scandal, just a spotless reputation, built on years of manipulating markets and controlling the flow of money. "This won't be easy," Danny muttered, closing the file and shoving it into his bag. "But if she's our ticket to Hargrove, we'll have to play it carefully." Jake nodded, his expression grim. "We need to move fast. Hargrove's people are out there, and they're watching. One slip-up, and it's over." Danny stood up, his mind already focused on the next move. "We start today." The next few days were a blur of covert surveillance, tracking Halloran's movements and attempting to gain any information that might give them a foothold. Halloran wasn't easy to find. She moved between high-end locations, rarely staying in one place for long. Her security was tight, and Danny knew that getting close to her would require precision, patience, and, above all, secrecy. But the more they uncovered, the clearer it became. Catherine Halloran wasn't just an innocent player in this game. She was deeply entrenched in the very system Danny was trying to destroy. Her connections ran deeper than anyone had anticipated. She wasn't just a financier. She was a key figure in the Covenant's operations. Finally, after days of careful observation, they found a lead. Halloran was scheduled to attend a gala in the heart of the city, a high-profile event that attracted the wealthiest and most powerful individuals. The perfect opportunity for Danny to make his move. Jake, however, was hesitant. "This could be our one shot, Danny. But if we go in there, we're playing with fire. If we're caught, we're done." Danny's resolve hardened. "We don't have a choice. This is the only lead we've got. And if I'm going to bring Hargrove down, I need to start somewhere. This is it." As the night of the gala approached, Danny's mind was consumed with the plan. He had no idea what he would face once he got inside, but he knew one thing for sure. The clock was ticking, and this was the moment that could change everything. The night of the gala arrived with an air of surreal tension. The grand ballroom gleamed with opulence, crystal chandeliers casting soft light over the sea of perfectly dressed men and women who mingled, their laughter and voices filling the space. But to Danny, it felt more like a battlefield, each conversation a potential threat, every smile hiding the sharp edges of a power struggle he couldn't yet fully understand. He stood at the entrance, surveying the scene, his heart pounding with anticipation. This was it, the moment where everything could change. If he played his cards right, he might finally get close enough to Catherine Halloran to expose the connections that tied her to the Covenant, and through her, he could reach Hargrove. But the stakes were high, and he knew that one wrong move could end it all. Jake, who had managed to secure an invitation to the event as a guest under a false identity, met Danny at the entrance. His face was partially obscured by a black mask, part of the masquerade theme for the evening, but Danny could still see the tension in his eyes. "We're in," Jake said, adjusting his tuxedo and checking his watch. "You know what to do. Stick to the plan, and we'll be fine." Danny nodded, though his nerves were starting to get the best of him. He adjusted his own mask, the deep black contrasting sharply against his crisp white suit. He had come to look the part businessman, part mystery, with just enough charm to blend in without drawing too much attention. Tonight, he wasn't just Danny anymore. He was a player in the game, and he had to keep his cool. They made their way through the crowd, past clusters of wealthy patrons discussing art, politics, and investments. A string quartet played softly in the background, and the air was filled with the scent of expensive perfumes and food. It was the epitome of privilege, a world far removed from the dangers Danny had been entangled in. He had to remind himself, this was his battlefield. He wasn't here to enjoy the sights. He was here for one reason only. "Look around," Jake whispered, nudging Danny's arm as they neared a cluster of guests. "Halloran should be somewhere nearby. Her circle is small, but it's exclusive. If she's here, she'll be surrounded by a couple of key figures. Stay low. Don't let her notice you." Danny's eyes scanned the crowd, searching for the one person who could either make or break everything he had worked for. And then, through the sea of glittering gowns and tuxedos, he saw her. Catherine Halloran. She was exactly as he had imagined. A striking woman in her early 40s, her posture impeccable, her face set with the cool confidence of someone who had always been in control. She was standing near a group of influential figures, laughing, but there was something almost predatory about her smile, as if she were constantly calculating. Danny's breath caught. This was her, the woman at the heart of the Covenant's operations. He had to get close. He had to find out what she knew. "Jake, we need a distraction," Danny muttered. "Something big enough to pull her attention away from the crowd. But it has to be subtle." Jake nodded, already scanning the room. "Leave it to me." Moments later, the soft sound of a glass shattering echoed through the hall. A woman screamed in surprise as a server accidentally dropped a tray of drinks, spilling champagne all over the floor. The crowd around the incident shifted, eyes drawn to the mess. Danny seized the opportunity. He moved swiftly, weaving through the crowd with practiced ease. He kept his head down, trying not to draw attention. He knew that Halloran was just ahead, and now was the time to make his move. As he approached her, he could feel his pulse quickening. The space between them narrowed, and he knew that one word, one mistake, could ruin everything. But he wasn't going to back down. He had to push forward. "Excuse me," Danny said, his voice smooth as he stepped up behind her. "It seems like we're both here for the same reason, don't you think?" Halloran turned, her expression unreadable as she studied him. There was a flash of recognition in her eyes, but it was quickly masked by a practiced smile. "And what reason would that be?" she replied, her voice cold but polite. Danny's mind raced, but he didn't let his nerves show. "To find the truth," he said, his tone confident. "To uncover the hidden forces that control everything. I think you know exactly what I mean." For a moment, Halloran's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something dark crossing her face. Then, just as quickly, her expression softened, and she tilted her head slightly, as if intrigued. "You're not from around here, are you?" she asked, her voice now laced with curiosity. "Who are you, exactly?" Danny smiled faintly, knowing this was a dangerous game. "Just someone who's tired of being controlled. I think you and I could help each other. Maybe you've been in the game long enough to know that the world doesn't work on its own. Someone has to pull the strings. And you, Ms. Halloran, are very good at pulling them." For the briefest moment, Halloran looked almost impressed. She studied him closely, and Danny could feel the weight of her gaze, like she was sizing him up, testing whether he was a threat or just another player trying to make his mark. "Bold," she said finally, after a long pause, "but not without merit. Let's talk, then. We'll find a more private place." Before Danny could respond, Halloran turned, signaling for her assistant to lead them toward a quieter part of the venue. The assistant, a sharply dressed man, nodded and began to walk ahead. Danny followed, his heart hammering in his chest. This was it, the chance he had been waiting for. But the feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes tracking his every move, never left him. As they entered a more secluded lounge, the low hum of conversation and music faded away. The room was dimly lit, plush chairs arranged around low tables. A single bartender stood by the far wall, but no one else was in sight. Halloran gestured for Danny to sit, her eyes still calculating. "So, mister?" She paused, waiting for him to give his name. "Danny," he replied quickly, keeping his tone casual. "And you don't need to worry about me. I'm just looking for a way out. A way to stop being a pawn." Halloran raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "A pawn? Everyone in this room is a pawn, Danny. The question is, who's your queen?" Danny leaned forward slightly, sensing that he had just moved into dangerous territory. "Maybe I don't need a queen. Maybe I just need the right kingmaker." The room seemed to grow colder as Halloran's smile faltered. "You've got a lot of nerve, don't you?" she said, her voice now tinged with something darker. "But you're making a mistake if you think you can outplay me. You're not the first person to try." Danny's instincts flared. She was playing a game, and he was stepping deeper into her world, but he wasn't backing down. Not now. He had come too far. "You underestimate me, Miss Halloran," Danny said. his voice low. "I don't need to outplay you. I just need to expose you." Halloran's eyes narrowed, her composure slipping for a moment. Then, just as quickly, it returned, colder than before. "We'll see about that, Danny." The tension in the room was palpable, thick with unspoken threats and promises. Danny knew that this conversation would decide his future. Whether he exposed Halloran and everything she stood for, or whether he became just another casualty in the game, it was all hanging in the balance. "Let's see who comes out on top," he said, leaning back, ready for whatever would come next. And so, the game began.